Esoteric Buddhism by A.P. Sinnett. 8th edition, reprinted 1903. Preface to the annotated edition. Since this book was first published in the beginning of 1883, I have come into possession of much additional information bearing on many of the problems dealt with. But I'm glad to say that such later teaching only reveals incompleteness in my original conception of the esoteric doctrine. No material error so far. Indeed, I have received from the great adept himself, from whom I obtained my instruction in the first instance, the assurance that the book as it now stands is a sound and trustworthy statement of the scheme of nature as understood by the initiates of occult science, which may have to be a good deal developed in the future, if the interest it excites is keen enough to constitute an efficient demand for further teaching of this kind on the part of the world at large, but will never have to be remodeled or apologized for. In view of this assurance, it seems best that I should now put forward my later conclusions and additional information in the form of annotations on each branch of the subject, rather than infuse them into the original text, which, under the circumstances, I am reluctant in any way to alter. I have therefore adopted that plan in the present edition, as conveying an indirect acknowledgement of the general harmony to be traced between these teachings and the recognized philosophical tenets of certain other great schools of Indian thought. I may here refer to criticisms on this book, which were published in the Indian magazine The Theosophist in June 1883 by a Brahman Hindu. The writer complains that in interpreting the esoteric doctrine, I have departed unnecessarily from accepted Sanskrit nomenclature, but his objection merely is that I have given unfamiliar names in some cases to ideas already embodied in Hindu sacred writings, and that I have done too much honor to the religious system commonly known as Buddhism, by representing that as more closely allied with the esoteric doctrine than any other. The popular wisdom of the majority of Hindus to this day, says my Brahman critic, is more or less tinged with the esoteric doctrine taught in Mr. Sinnett's book, misnamed Esoteric Buddhism, while there is not a single village or hamlet in the whole of India in which people are not more or less acquainted with the sublime tenets of the Vedanta philosophy, the effects of karma in the next birth, the enjoyment of its fruits, good or evil, in a subjective or spiritual state of existence prior to the reincarnation of the spiritual monad in this or any other world, the loitering of the unsatisfied souls or human shells in the earth karma Loca. The Pralaic and Manvantaric periods are not only intelligible, but are even familiar to a great many Hindus under names different from those made use by the author of Esoteric Buddhism. So much the better, I take leave to rejoin, from the point of view of Western readers to whom it must be a matter of indifference whether the esoteric Hindu or Buddhist religion is nearest to absolutely true spiritual science, which should certainly bear no name that appears to wed it to any one faith in the external world more than to another. All that we in Europe can be anxious for is to arrive at a clear understanding as to the essential principles of that science, and if we find the principles defined in this book claimed by the cultured representatives of more than one great Oriental creed, as equally the underlying truths of their different systems, we shall be all the better inclined to believe the present exposition of doctrine worth our attention. In regard to the complaint itself, that the teachings here reduced to an intelligible shape are incorrectly described by the name this book bears, I cannot do better than quote the note by which the editor of the Theosophist replies to his Brahman contributor. This note says, "We print the above letter as it expresses in courteous language, and in an able manner, the views of a large number of our Hindu brothers." At the same time, it must be stated that the name of Esoteric Buddhism was given to Mr. Sinnett's latest publication, not because the doctrine propounded therein is meant to be specially identified with any particular form of faith, but because Buddhism means the doctrine of the Buddhas, the wise, that is, the wisdom religion. For my own part, I need only add that I fully accept and adopt that explanation of the matter. It would indeed be a misconception of the design which this book is intended to subserve, to suppose it concerned with the recommendation to a dilettante modern taste of old world fashions in religious thought. The external forms and fancies of religion in one age may be a little purer, in another a little more corrupt, but they inevitably adapt themselves to their period, and it would be extravagant to imagine them interchangeable. The present statement is not put forward in the hope of making Buddhists from among the adherents of any other system, but with the view of conveying to thoughtful readers, as well in the East as in the West, a series of leading ideas relating to the actual verities of nature and the real facts of man's progress through evolution, which have been communicated to the present writer by Eastern philosophers, and thus fall most readily into an Oriental mold. For the value of these teachings will perhaps be most fully realized when we clearly perceive that they are scientific in their character rather than controversial. Spiritual truths, if they are truths, may evidently be dealt with in a no less scientific spirit than chemical reactions, and no religious feeling, of whatever color it may be, need be disturbed by the importation into the general stock of knowledge of new discoveries about the constitution and nature of man on the plane of his higher activities. True religion will eventually find a way to assimilate much fresh knowledge, in the same way that it always finally acquiesces in a general enlargement of knowledge on the physical plane. This, in the first instance, may sometimes disconcert notions associated with religious belief, as geological science at first embarrassed biblical chronology. But in time, men came to see that the essence of the biblical statement does not reside in the literal sense of the cosmological passages in the Old Testament, and religious conceptions grew all the purer for the relief thus afforded. In just the same way, when positive scientific knowledge begins to embrace a comprehension of the laws relating to the spiritual development of man, some misconceptions of nature, long blended with religion, may have to give way, but still it will be found that the central ideas of true religion have been cleared up and strengthened all the better for the process. Especially as such processes continue, will the internal dissensions of the religious world be inevitably subdued. The warfare of sects can only be due to a failure on the part of rival sectarians to grasp fundamental facts. Could a time come when the basic ideas on which religion rests should be comprehended with the same certainty with which we comprehend some primary physical laws, and disagreement about them be recognized by all educated people as ridiculous? Then there would not be room for very acrimonious divergences of religious sentiment. Externals of religious thought would still differ in different climates and among different races, as dress and dietaries differ, but such differences would not give rise to intellectual antagonism. Basic facts of the nature indicated are developed, it appears to me, in the exposition of spiritual science we have now obtained from our Eastern friends. It is quite unnecessary for religious thinkers to turn aside from them, under the impression that they are arguments in favor of some Eastern, in preference to the more general Western creed. If medical science were to discover a new fact about man's body, were to unveil some hitherto concealed principle on which the growth of skin and flesh and bone is carried on, that discovery would not be regarded as trenching at all on the domain of religion. Would the domain of religion be invaded, for example, by a discovery that should go one step behind the action of the nerves, and disclose a finer set of activities manipulating these as they manipulate the muscles? At all events, even if such a discovery might begin to reconcile science and religion, no man who allows any of his higher faculties to enter into his religious thinking would put aside a positive fact of nature plainly shown to be such as hostile to religion. Being a fact, it would inevitably fit in with all other facts, and with religious truth among the number. So with the great mass of information in reference to the spiritual evolution of man embodied in the present statement, our best plan evidently is to ask, before we look into the report I bring forward, not whether it will square in all respects with preconceived views, but whether it really does introduce us to a series of natural facts connected with the growth and development of man's higher faculties. If it does this, we may wisely examine the facts first in the scientific spirit, and leave them to exercise whatever effect on collateral belief may be reasonable and legitimate later on, ramifying, as the explanation proceeds, into a great many side paths. It will be seen that the central statement now put forward constitutes a theory of anthropology, which completes and spiritualizes the ordinary notions of physical evolution. The theory which traces man's development by successive and very gradual improvements of animal forms from generation to generation is a very barren and miserable theory regarded as an all-embracing account of creation, but properly understood, it paves the way for a comprehension of the higher concurrent process, which is all the while evolving the soul of man in the spiritual realm of existence. The present view of the matter reconciles the evolutionary method with the deeply seated craving of every self-conscious entity for perpetuity of individual life. The disjointed series of improving forms on this earth have no individuality, and the life of each in turn is a separate transaction which finds in the next similar transaction no compensation for suffering involved, no justice, no fruit of its efforts. It is just possible to argue on the assumption of a new independent creation of a human soul every time a new human form is produced by physiological growth, that in the after-spiritual states of such soul, justice may be awarded. But then this conception is itself at variance with a fundamental idea of evolution, which traces, or believes that it traces the origin of each soul to the workings of highly developed matter in each case. Nor is it less at variance with the analogies of nature, but without going into that, it is enough for the moment to perceive that the theory of spiritual evolution, as set forth in the teaching of esoteric science is at any rate in harmony with these analogies, while at the same time it satisfactorily meets the requirements of justice and of the instinctive demand for continuity of individual life. This theory recognizes the evolution of the soul as a process that is quite continuous in itself, though carried out partly through the instrumentality of a great series of dissociated forms. Putting aside for the moment of profound metaphysics of the theory which trace the principle of life from the original first cause of the cosmos, we find the soul as an entity emerging from the animal kingdom and passing into the earliest human forms, without being at that time ripe for the higher intellectual life with which the present state of humanity renders us familiar, but through successive incarnations in forms whose physical improvement, under the Darwinian law, is constantly fitting them to be its habitation at each return to objective life, it gradually gathers that enormous range of experience which is summed up in its higher development. In the intervals between its physical incarnations, it prolongs and works out, and finally exhausts or transmutes into so much abstract development, the personal experiences of each life. This is the clue to the true explanation of that apparent difficulty which besets the cruder form of the theory of reincarnation, which independent speculation has sometimes thrown out. Each man is unconscious of having led previous lives, therefore he contends that subsequent lives can afford him no compensation for this one. He overlooks the enormous importance of the intervening spiritual condition, in which he by no means forgets the personal adventures and emotions he has just passed through, and in the course of which he distills these into so much cosmic progress. In the following pages, the elucidation of this profoundly interesting mystery is attempted, and it will be seen that the view of events now afforded us is not only a solution of the problems of life and death, but of many very perplexing experiences on the borderland between those conditions, or rather between physical and spiritual life, which have engaged attention and speculation so widely of recent years in most civilized countries. Preface to the original edition. The teachings embodied in the present volume let in a flood of light on questions connected with Buddhist doctrine which have deeply perplexed previous writers on the religion, and offer the world for the first time a practical clue to the meaning of almost all ancient religious symbolism. More than this, the esoteric doctrine, when properly understood, will be found to advance an overpowering claim on the attention of earnest thinkers. Its tenets are not presented to us as the invention of any founder or prophet. Its testimony is based on no written scriptures. Its views of nature have been evolved by the researches of an immense succession of investigators, qualified for their task by the possession of spiritual faculties and perceptions of a higher order than those belonging to ordinary humanity. In the course of ages, the block of knowledge thus accumulated concerning the origin of the world and of man, and the ultimate destinies of our race, concerning also the nature of other worlds and states of existence differing from those of our present life, checked and examined at every point, verified, in all directions and constantly under examination throughout, has come to be looked on by its custodians as constituting the absolute truth concerning spiritual things, the actual state of the facts regarding vast regions of vital activity lying beyond this earthly existence. European philosophy, whether concerned with religion or pure metaphysics, has so long been used to a sense of insecurity in speculations outrunning the limits of physical experiment, that absolute truth about spiritual things is hardly recognized any longer by prudent thinkers as a reasonable object of pursuit, but different habits of thought have been acquired in Asia. The secret doctrine which, to a considerable extent, I am now enabled to expound, is regarded not only by all its adherents, but by vast numbers who have never expected to know more of it than that such a doctrine exists, as a mine of entirely trustworthy knowledge from which all religions and philosophies have derived whatever they possess of truth, and with which every religion must coincide if it claims to be a mode of expression for truth. This is a bold claim indeed, but I venture to announce the following exposition as one of immense importance to the world, because I believe that claim can be substantiated. I do not say that within the compass of this volume the authenticity of the esoteric doctrine can be proved. Such proof cannot be given by any process of argument, only through the development in each inquirer for himself of the faculties required for the direct observation of nature along the lines indicated. But his prima facie conclusion may be determined by the extent to which the views of nature about to be unfolded may recommend themselves to his mind, and by the reasons which exist for trusting the powers of observation of those by whom they are communicated. Will it be supposed that the very magnitude of the claim now made on behalf of the esoteric doctrine lifts the present statement out of the region of inquiry to which its title refers, inquiry as to the real inner meaning of the definite and specific religion called Buddhism? The fact is, however, that esoteric Buddhism, though by no means divorced from the associations of exoteric Buddhism, must not be conceived to constitute a mere imperium in imperio, a central school of culture in the vortex of the Buddhist world. In proportion as Buddhism retreats into the inner penetralia of its faith, these are found to merge into the inner penetralia of other faiths. The cosmic conceptions and the knowledge of nature on which Buddhism not merely rests, but which constitute esoteric Buddhism, equally constitute esoteric Brahmanism, and the esoteric doctrine is thus regarded by those of all creeds who are enlightened, in the Buddhist sense, as the absolute truth concerning nature, man, the origin of the universe, and the destinies toward which its inhabitants are tending. At the same time, exoteric Buddhism has remained in closer union with the esoteric doctrine than any other popular religion. An exposition of the inner knowledge, addressed to English readers in the present day, will thus associate itself irresistibly with familiar outlines of Buddhist teaching. It will certainly impart to these a living meaning they generally seem to be without, but all the more on this account may the esoteric doctrine be most conveniently studied in its Buddhist aspect. One, moreover, which has been so strongly impressed upon it since the time of Gautama Buddha, that though the essence of the doctrine dates back to a far more remote antiquity, the Buddhist coloring has now permeated its whole substance. That which I am about to put before the reader is esoteric Buddhism, and for European students approaching it for the first time, any other designation would be a misnomer. The statement I have to make must be considered in its entirety before the reader will be able to comprehend why initiates in the esoteric doctrine regard the concession involved in the present disclosures of the general outlines of this doctrine as one of startling magnitude. One explanation of this feeling, however, may be readily seen to spring from the extreme sacredness that has always been attached by their ancient guardians to the inner vital truths of nature. Hitherto this sacredness has always prescribed their absolute concealment from the profane herd, and so far as that policy of concealment, the tradition of countless ages, is now being given up. The new departure which the appearance of this volume signalizes will be contemplated with surprise and regret by a great many initiated disciples. The surrender to criticism, which may sometimes perhaps be clumsy and irreverent, of doctrines which have hitherto been regarded by such persons as too majestic in their import to be talked of at all except under circumstances of befitting solemnity, will seem to them a terrible profanation of the great mysteries. From the European point of view, it would be unreasonable to expect that such a book as this can be exempt from the usual rough and tumble treatment of new ideas, and special convictions or commonplace bigotry may sometimes render such treatment in the present case peculiarly inimical. But all that, though a matter of course to European exponents of the doctrine like myself, will seem very grievous and disgusting to its earlier and more regular representatives. They will appeal sadly to the wisdom of the time-honored rule which, in the old symbolical way, forbade the initiates from casting pearls before swine. Happily, as I think, the rule has not been allowed to operate any longer to the prejudice of those who, while still far from being initiated in the occult sense of the term, will probably have become, by sheer force of modern culture, qualified to appreciate the concession. Part of the information contained in the following pages was first thrown out in a fragmentary form in The Theosophist, a monthly magazine published at Madras by the leaders of the Theosophical Society. As almost all the articles referred to have been my own writing, I have not hesitated to weld parts of them, when this course has been convenient, into the present volume. A certain advantage is gained by thus showing how the separate pieces of the mosaic as first presented to public notice drop naturally into their places in the comparatively finished pavement. The doctrine or system now disclosed in its broad outlines has been so jealously guarded hitherto that no mere literary researches, though they might have curry-combed all India, could have brought to light any morsel of the information thus revealed. It is given out to the world at last by the free grace of those in whose keeping it has hitherto lain. Nothing could ever have extorted from them its very first letter. It is only after a perusal of the present explanations that their position generally, as regards their present disclosures or their previous reticence, can be criticized or even comprehended. The views of nature now put forward are altogether unfamiliar to European thinkers. The policy of the graduates in esoteric knowledge, which has grown out of their long intimacy with these views, must be considered in connection with the peculiar bearings of the doctrine itself. As for the circumstances under which these revelations were first foreshadowed in the Theosophist, and are now rounded off and expanded as my readers will perceive, it is enough for the moment to say that the Theosophical Society, through my connection, with which the materials dealt with in this volume have come into my hands, owes its establishment to certain persons who are among the custodians of esoteric science. The information poured out at last for the benefit of all who are ripe to receive it has been destined for communication to the world through the Theosophical Society since the foundation of that body, and later circumstances only have indicated myself as the agent through whom the communication could be conveniently made. Let me add that I do not regard myself as the sole exponent for the outer world at this crisis of esoteric truth. These teachings are the outcome, as regards philosophical knowledge, of the relations with the outer world which have been established by the custodians of esoteric truth through me. And it is only regarding the acts and intentions of those esoteric teachers who have chosen to work through me that I can have any certain knowledge. But, in different ways, some other writers seem to be engaged in expounding for the benefit of the world, and, as I believe, in accordance with a great plan, of which this volume is a part, the same truths in different aspects that I am commissioned to unfold. Probably the great activity at present of literary speculation dealing with problems that overstep the range of physical knowledge may also be in some way provoked by that policy, on the part of the great custodians of esoteric truth, of which my own book is certainly one manifestation. Again, the ardor now shown in psychical research by the very distinguished, highly gifted and cultivated men who lead the society in London devoted to that object is, to my inner convictions, knowing as I do something of the way the spiritual aspirations of the world are silently influenced by those whose work lies in that department of nature, the obvious fruit of efforts parallel to those with which I am more immediately concerned. It only remains for me to disclaim, on behalf of the treatise which ensues, any pretension to high finish as regards the language in which it is cast. Longer familiarity with the vast and complicated scheme of cosmogony disclosed will no doubt suggest improvements in the phraseology employed to expound it. 2 years ago, neither I nor any other European living knew the alphabet of the science here for the first time put into a scientific shape, or subject at all events to an attempt in that direction, the science of spiritual causes and their effects, of superphysical consciousness, of cosmical evolution, though ideas had begun to offer themselves to the world in more or less embarrassing disguise of mystic symbology. No attempt had ever been made by any esoteric teacher 2 years back to put the doctrine forward in its plain abstract purity. As my own instruction progressed on those lines, I have had to coin phrases and suggest English words as equivalents for the ideas which were presented to my mind. I am by no means convinced that in all cases I have coined the best possible phrases and hit on the most neatly expressive words. For example, at the threshold of the subject, we come upon the necessity of giving some name to the various elements or attributes of which the complete human creature is made up. Element would be an impossible word to use, on account of the confusion that would arise from its use in other significations, and the least objectionable on the whole seemed to me principle, though to an ear trained in the niceties of metaphysical expression, this word will have a very unsatisfactory sound in some of its present applications. Quite possibly, therefore, in process of time, the Western nomenclature of the esoteric doctrine may be greatly developed in advance of that I have provisionally constructed. The Oriental nomenclature is far more elaborate, but metaphysical Sanskrit seems to be painfully embarrassing to a translator. The fault, my Indian friends assure me, not of Sanskrit, but of the language in which they are now required to express the Sanskrit ideal. Eventually we may find that, with the help of a little borrowing from familiar Greek quarries, English may prove more receptive of the new doctrine, or rather of the primeval doctrine as newly disclosed, than has been supposed in the East. Chapter 1. Esoteric Teachers. The information contained in the following pages is no collection of inferences deduced from study. I am bringing to my readers knowledge which I have obtained by favor, rather than by effort. It will not be found the less valuable on that account. I venture, on the contrary, to declare that it will be found of incalculably greater value, easily as I have obtained it, than any results in a similar direction which I could possibly have procured by ordinary methods of research, even had I possessed, in the highest degree, that which I make no claim to possess at all, Oriental scholarship. Everyone who has been concerned with Indian literature, and still more, anyone who in India has taken interest in talking with cultivated natives on philosophical subjects, will be aware of a general conviction existing in the East that there are men living who know a great deal more about philosophy in the highest acceptation of the word, the science, the true knowledge of spiritual things, than can be found recorded in any books. In Europe, the notion of secrecy, as applied to science, is so repulsive to the prevailing instinct that the first inclination of European thinkers is to deny the existence of that which they so much dislike. But circumstances have fully assured me during my residence in India that the conviction just referred to is perfectly well-founded, and I have been privileged at last to receive a very considerable mass of instruction in the hitherto secret knowledge over which Oriental philosophers have brooded silently till now. Instruction which has hitherto been only imparted to sympathetic students, prepared themselves to migrate into the camp of secrecy. Their teachers have been more than content that all other inquirers should be left in doubt as to whether there was anything of importance to learn at their hands. With quite as much antipathy at starting as anyone could have entertained to the old Oriental policy in regard to knowledge, I came, nevertheless, to perceive that the old Oriental knowledge itself was a very real and important possession. It may be excusable to regard the high grapes as sour so long as they are quite out of reach, but it would be foolish to persist in that opinion if a tall friend hands down a bunch and one finds them sweet. For reasons that will appear as the present explanations proceed, the very considerable block of hitherto secret teaching this volume contains has been conveyed to me, not only without conditions of the usual kind, but to the express end that I might convey it in my turn to the world at large. Without the light of hitherto secret Oriental knowledge, it is impossible by any study of its published literature, English or Sanskrit, for students of even the most scholarly qualifications to reach a comprehension of the inner doctrines and real meaning of any Oriental religion. This assertion conveys no reproach to the sympathetic, learned, and industrious writers of great ability who have studied Oriental religions generally, and Buddhism especially, in their external aspects. Buddhism, above all, is a religion which has enjoyed a dual existence from the very beginning of its introduction to the world. The real inner meaning of its doctrines has been kept back from uninitiated students, while the outer teachings have merely presented the multitude with a code of moral lessons and a veiled symbolical literature, hinting at the existence of knowledge in the background. This secret knowledge, in reality, long antedated the passage through earth life of Gautama Buddha. Brahmin philosophy, in ages before Buddha, embodied the identical doctrine which may now be described as Esoteric Buddhism. Its outlines had indeed been blurred, its scientific form partially confused, but the general body of knowledge was already in possession of a select few before Buddha came to deal with it. Buddha, however, undertook the task of revising and refreshing the esoteric science of the inner circle of initiates, as well as the morality of the outer world. The circumstances under which this work was done have been wholly misunderstood, nor would a straightforward explanation thereof be intelligible without explanations, which must first be furnished by a survey of the esoteric science itself. From Buddha's time till now, the esoteric science referred to has been jealously guarded as a precious heritage, belonging exclusively to regularly initiated members of mysteriously organized associations. These, so far as Buddhism is concerned, are the arahats, or more properly arhats, referred to in Buddhist literature. They are the initiates who tread the fourth path of holiness spoken of in esoteric Buddhist writings. Mr. Rhys Davids, referring to a multiplicity of original texts and Sanskrit authorities, says, "One might fill pages with the awestruck and ecstatic praise which is lavished in Buddhist writings on this condition of mind, the fruit of the fourth path, the state of an arahat, of a man made perfect according to the Buddhist faith." And then making a series of running quotations from Sanskrit authorities, he says, "To him who has finished the path and passed beyond sorrow, who has freed himself on all sides, thrown away every fetter, there is no more fever or grief, ... For such there are no more births, ... They are in the enjoyment of nirvana. Their old karma is exhausted. No new karma is being produced. Their hearts are free from the longing after future life, and no new yearnings springing up within them. They, the wise, are extinguished like a lamp." These passages, and all like them, convey to European readers at all events an entirely false idea as to what sort of person an arhat really is, as to the life he leads while on earth, and what he anticipates later on. But the elucidation of such points may be postponed for the moment. Some further passages from exoteric treatises may first be selected to show what an arhat is generally supposed to be. Mr. Rhys Davids, speaking of jhana and samadhi, the belief that it was possible by intense self-absorption to attain supernatural faculties and powers, goes on to say, "So far as I am aware, no instance is recorded of any one, not either a member of the order or a Brahmin ascetic, acquiring these powers. A Buddha always possessed them. Whether arahats as such could work the particular miracles in question, and whether of mendicants, only arahats or only asekas could do so, is at present not clear. Very little in the sources of information on the subject that have hitherto been explored will be found clear. But I am now merely endeavoring to show that Buddhist literature teems with allusions to the greatness and powers of the arhats. For more intimate knowledge concerning them, Special circumstances must furnish us with the required explanations. Mr. Arthur Lillie, in Buddha and Early Buddhism, tells us, 6 supernatural faculties were expected of the ascetic before he could claim the grade of arhat. They are constantly alluded to in the sutras as the 6 supernatural faculties, usually without further specification. Man has a body composed of the 4 elements. In this transitory body his intelligence is enchained. The ascetic, finding himself thus confused, directs his mind to the creation of the manas. He represents to himself, in thought, another body created from this material body, a body with a form, members, and organs. This body, in relation to the material body, is like the sword and the scabbard, or a serpent issuing from a basket in which it is confined. The ascetic then, purified and perfected, begins to practice supernatural faculties. He finds himself able to pass through material obstacles, walls, ramparts, ANC. He is able to throw his phantasmal appearance into many places at once. He can leave this world and even reach the heaven of Brahma himself. He acquires the power of hearing the sounds of the unseen world as distinctly as those of the phenomenal world, more distinctly in point of fact. Also by the power of manas, he is able to read the most secret thoughts of others and to tell their characters. And so on with illustrations. Mr. Lillie has not quite accurately divined the nature of the truth lying behind this popular version of the facts, but it is hardly necessary to quote more to show that the powers of the arhats and their insight into spiritual things are respected by the world of Buddhism most profoundly, even though the arhats themselves have been singularly indisposed to favor the world with autobiographies or scientific accounts of the 6 supernatural powers. A few sentences from Mr. Hoey's recent translation of Dr. Oldenburg's Buddha, his life, his doctrine, his order, may fall conveniently into this place, and then we may pass on. We read, Buddhist proverbial philosophy attributes in innumerable passages the possession of nirvana to the saint who still treads the earth. The disciple who has put off lust and desire, rich in wisdom, has here on earth attained deliverance from death, the rest, the nirvana, the eternal state. He who has escaped from the trackless hard mazes of the samsara, who has crossed over and reached the shore, self-absorbed, without stumbling and without doubt, who has delivered himself from the earthly and attained nirvana, him I call a true Brahmin. If the saint will even now put an end to his state of being, he can do so, but the majority stand fast until nature has reached her goal. Of such may those words be said which are put in the mouth of the most prominent of Buddha's disciples, I long not for death, I long not for life. I wait till mine hour come, like a servant who awaiteth his reward. A multiplication of such quotations would merely involve the repetition in various forms of exoteric conceptions concerning the arhats. Like every fact or thought in Buddhism, the arhat has 2 aspects, that in which he is presented to the world at large, and that in which he lives, moves, and has his being. In the popular estimation, he is a saint, waiting for a spiritual reward of the kind the populace can understand, a wonder worker, meanwhile, by favor of supernatural agencies. In reality, he is the long, tried and proved worthy custodian of the deepest and innermost philosophy of the one fundamental religion which Buddha refreshed and restored, and a student of natural science standing in the very foremost front of human knowledge, in regard not merely to the mysteries of spirit, but to the material constitution of the world as well. Arhat is a Buddhist designation, that which is. More familiar in India, where the attributes of arhatship are not necessarily associated with professions of Buddhism, is Mahatma. With stories about the Mahatmas, India is saturated. The older Mahatmas are generally spoken of as rishis, but the terms are interchangeable, and I have heard the title rishi applied to men now living. All the attributes of the arhats mentioned in Buddhist writings are described with no less reverence in Indian literature as those of the Mahatmas, and this volume might be readily filled with translations of vernacular books, giving accounts of miraculous achievements by such of them as are known to history and tradition by name. In reality, the arhats and the Mahatmas are the same men. At that level of spiritual exaltation, supreme knowledge of the esoteric doctrine blends all original sectarian distinctions. By whatever name such Illuminati may be called, they are the adepts of occult knowledge, sometimes spoken of in India now as the brothers, and the custodians of the spiritual science which has been handed down to them by their predecessors. We may search both ancient and modern literature in vain, however, for any systematic explanation of their doctrine or science. A good deal of this is dimly set forth in occult writing, but very little of this is of the least use to readers who take up the subject without previous knowledge acquired independently of books. It is under favor of direct instruction from one of their number that I am now enabled to attempt an outline of the Mahatmas' teaching, and it is in the same way that I have picked. Up what I know concerning the organization to which most of them, and the greatest, in the present day belong. All over the world there are occultists of various degrees of eminence, and occult fraternities even, which have a great deal in common with the leading fraternity now established in Tibet. But all my inquiries into the subject have convinced me that the Tibetan Brotherhood is incomparably the highest of such associations, and regarded, as such by all other associations, worthy of being looked upon themselves as really enlightened in the occult sense of the term. There are, it is true, many isolated mystics in India, who are altogether self-taught and unconnected with occult bodies. Many of these will explain that they themselves attained to higher pinnacles of spiritual enlightenment than the brothers of Tibet, or any other people on earth. But the examination of such claims in all cases I have encountered would, I think, lead any impartial outsider, however little qualified himself by personal development to be a judge of occult enlightenment, to the conclusion that they are altogether unfounded. I know one native of India, for example, a man of European education, holding a high appointment under government, of good station in society, most elevated character, and enjoying unusual respect with such Europeans as are concerned with him in official life, who will only accord to the brothers of Tibet a second place in the world of spiritual enlightenment. The first place he regards as occupied by one person, now in this world no longer, his own occult master in life, whom he resolutely asserts to have been an incarnation of the Supreme Being. His own, my friend's, inner senses were so awakened by this master that the visions of his entranced state, into which he can still throw himself at will, are to him the only spiritual region in which he can feel interested. Convinced that the Supreme Being was his personal instructor from the beginning, and continues so still in the subjective state, he is naturally inaccessible to suggestions that his impressions may be distorted by reason of his own misdirected psychological development. Again, the highly cultivated devotees, to be met with occasionally in India, who build up a conception of nature, the universe and God, entirely on a metaphysical basis, and who have evolved their systems by sheer force of transcendental thinking, will take some established system of philosophy as its groundwork, and amplify on this to an extent which only an Oriental metaphysician could dream of. They win disciples who put implicit faith in them, and found their little school which flourishes for a time within its own limits. But speculative philosophy of such a kind is rather occupation for the mind than knowledge. Such masters, by comparison with the organized adepts of the highest brotherhood, are like rowing boats compared with ocean steamships, helpful conveyances on their own native lake or river, but not craft to whose protection you can trust yourself on a worldwide voyage of exploration over the sea. Descending lower again in the scale, we find India dotted all over with yogis and fakirs, in all stages of self-development, from that of dirty savages, but little elevated above the gypsy fortune-tellers of an English racecourse, to men whose seclusion a stranger will find it very difficult to penetrate, and whose abnormal faculties and powers need only be seen or experienced to shatter the incredulity of the most contented representative of modern Western skepticism. Careless inquirers are very apt to confound such persons with the great adepts of whom they may vaguely hear. Concerning the real adepts, meanwhile, I cannot at present venture on any account of what the Tibetan organization is like, as regards its highest ruling authorities, those Mahatmas themselves, of whom some more or less adequate conception may, perhaps, be formed by readers who will follow me patiently to the end, are subordinate by several degrees to the chief of all. Let us deal rather with the earlier conditions of occult training, which can more easily be grasped. The level of elevation which constitutes a man, what the outer world calls a Mahatma or brother, is only attained after prolonged and weary probation, and anxious ordeals of really terrible severity. One may find people who have spent 20 or 30 years or more in blameless and arduous devotion to the life task on which they have entered, and are still in the earlier degrees of chelaship, still looking up to the heights of adeptship as far above their heads. And at whatever age a boy or man dedicates himself to the occult career, he dedicates himself to it, be it remembered, without any reservations and for life. The task he undertakes is the development in himself of a great many faculties and attributes, which are so utterly dormant in ordinary mankind that their very existence is unsuspected, the possibility of their development denied. And these faculties and attributes must be developed by the chela himself, with very little, if any, help, beyond guidance and direction from his master. The adept, says an occult aphorism, becomes, he is not made. One may illustrate this point by reference to a very commonplace physical exercise. Every man living, having the ordinary use of his limbs, is qualified to swim. But put those who, as the common phrase goes, cannot swim, into deep water, and they will struggle and be drowned. The mere way to move the limbs is no mystery, but unless the swimmer in moving them has a full belief that such movement will produce the required result is not produced. In this case, we are dealing with mechanical forces merely, but the same principle runs up into dealings with subtler forces. Very much further than people generally imagine will mere confidence carry the occult neophyte. How many European readers who would be quite incredulous if told of some results which occult chelas in the most incipient stages of their training have to accomplish by sheer force of confidence? Hear constantly in church, nevertheless, the familiar biblical assurances of the power which resides in faith, and let the words pass by like the wind, leaving no impression. The great end and purpose of adeptship is the achievement of spiritual development, the nature of which is only veiled and disguised by the common phrases of exoteric language that the adept seeks. To unite his soul with God, that he may thereby pass into nirvana, is a statement that conveys no definite meaning to the ordinary reader, and the more he examines it with the help of ordinary books and methods, the less likely will he be to realize the nature of the process contemplated, or of the condition desired. It will be necessary to deal first with the esoteric conception of nature and the origin and destinies of man, which differ widely from theological conceptions, before an explanation of the aim which the adept pursues can become intelligible. Meanwhile, however, it is desirable, at the very outset, to disabuse the reader of one misconception in regard to the objects of adeptship that he may very likely have framed. The development of those spiritual faculties, whose culture has to do with the highest objects of the occult life, gives rise, as it progresses, to a great deal of incidental knowledge, having to do with the physical laws of nature not yet generally understood. This knowledge, and the practical art of manipulating certain obscure forces of nature, which it brings in its train, invest an adept, and even an adept's pupils, at a comparatively early stage of their education, with very extraordinary powers, the application of which to matters of daily life will sometimes produce results that seem altogether miraculous, and, from the ordinary point of view, the acquisition of apparently miraculous power is such a stupendous achievement that people are sometimes apt to fancy that the adept's object in seeking the knowledge he attains has been to invest himself with these coveted powers. It would be as reasonable to say of any great patriot of military history that his object in becoming a soldier had been to wear a gay uniform and impress the imagination of the nursemaids. The Oriental method of cultivating knowledge has always differed diametrically from that pursued in the West during the growth of modern science. Whilst Europe has investigated nature as publicly as possible, every step being discussed with the utmost freedom, and every fresh fact acquired, circulated at once for the benefit of all, Asiatic science has been studied secretly and its conquests jealously guarded. I need not as yet attempt either criticism or defense of its methods, but at all events, these methods have been relaxed to some extent in my own case, and, as already stated, it is with the full consent of my teachers that I now follow the bent of my own inclinations as a European, and communicate what I have learned to all who may be willing to receive it. Later on, it will be seen how the departure from the ordinary rules of occult study embodied in the concessions now made falls naturally into its place in the whole scheme of occult philosophy. The approaches to that philosophy have always been open in one sense to all. Vaguely throughout the world in various ways has been diffused the idea that some process of study, which men here and there did actually follow, might lead to the acquisition of a higher kind of knowledge than that taught to mankind at large, in books or by public religious preachers. The East, as pointed out, has always been more than vaguely impressed with this belief, but even in the West the whole block of symbolical literature relating to astrology, alchemy, and mysticism generally has fermented in European society, carrying to some few peculiarly receptive and qualified minds the conviction that behind all this superficially meaningless nonsense great truths lay concealed. For such persons, eccentric study has sometimes revealed hidden passages leading to the grandest imaginable realms of enlightenment. But till now, in all such cases, in accordance with the law of those schools, the neophyte no sooner forced his way into the region of mystery than he was bound over to the most inviolable secrecy as to everything connected with his entrance and further progress there. In Asia, in the same way, the chela, or pupil of occultism, no sooner became a chela than he ceased to be a witness on behalf of the reality of occult knowledge. I have been astonished to find, since my own connection with the subject, how numerous such chelas are. But it is impossible to imagine any human act more improbable than the unauthorized revelation by any such chela to persons in the outer world that he is one, and so the great esoteric school of philosophy successfully guards its seclusion. In a former book, The Occult World, I have given a full and straightforward narrative of the circumstances under which I came in contact with the gifted and deeply instructed men from whom I have since obtained the teaching this volume contains. I need not repeat the story. I now come forward prepared to deal with the subject in a new way. The existence of occult adepts and the importance of their requirements may be established along two different lines of argument. Firstly, by means of external evidence, the testimony of qualified witnesses, the manifestation by or through persons connected with adepts, of abnormal faculties affording more than a presumption of abnormally enlarged knowledge. Secondly, by the presentation of such a considerable portion of this knowledge as may convey intrinsic assurances of its own value. My first book proceeded by the former method. I now approach the more formidable task of working on the latter. Annotations. The further we advance in occult study, the more exalted in many ways become our conceptions of the Mahatmas. The complete comprehension of the manner in which these persons become differentiated from humankind at large is not to be achieved by the help of mere intellectual effort. These are aspects of the adept nature which have to do with the extraordinary development of the higher principles in man, which cannot be realized by the application of the lower. But while crude conceptions in the beginning thus fall very short of reaching the real level of the facts, a curious complication of the problem arises in this way. Our first idea of an adept who has achieved the power of penetrating the tremendous secrets of spiritual nature is modeled on our conception of a very highly gifted man of science on our own plane. We are apt to think of him as once an adept, always an adept, as a very exalted human being who must necessarily bring into play in all the relations of his life the attributes that attach to him as a Mahatma. In this way, while, as above pointed out, we shall certainly fail, do all we can, to do justice in our thoughts to his attributes as a Mahatma, we may very easily run to the opposite extreme in our thinking about him in his ordinary human aspect, and thus land ourselves in many perplexities, as we acquire a partial familiarity with the characteristics of the occult world. It is just because the highest attributes of adeptship have to do with principles in human nature which quite transcend the limits of physical existence that the adept or Mahatma can only be such in the highest acceptation of the word, when he is, as the phrase goes, out of the body, or at all events thrown by special efforts of his will into an abnormal condition. When he is not called upon to make such efforts, or to pass entirely beyond the limitations of this fleshly prison, he is much more like an ordinary man than experience of him, in some of his aspects, would lead his disciples to believe. A correct appreciation of this state of things explains the apparent contradiction involved in the position of the occult pupil towards his masters, as compared with some of the declarations that the master himself will frequently put forward. For example, the Mahatmas are persistent in asserting that they are not infallible, that they are men, like the rest of us, perhaps with a somewhat more enlarged comprehension of nature than the generality of mankind, but still liable to err both in the direction of practical business with which they may be concerned, and in their estimate of the characters of other men, or the capacity of candidates for occult development. But how are we to reconcile statements of this nature with the fundamental principle at the bottom of all occult research, which enjoins the neophyte to put his trust in the teaching and guidance of his master absolutely and without reserve? The solution of the difficulty is found in the state of things above referred to. While the adept may be a man quite surprisingly liable to err sometimes in the manipulation of worldly business, just as with ourselves, some of the greatest men of genius are liable to make mistakes in their daily life that matter-of-fact people would never commit. On the other hand, directly a Mahatma comes to deal with the higher mysteries of spiritual science, he does so by virtue of the exercise of his Mahatma attributes, and in dealing with these can hardly be recognized as liable to err. This consideration enables us to feel that the trustworthiness of the teachings derived from such a source as those which have inspired the present volume is altogether above the reach of small incidents, which in the progress of our experience may seem to claim a revision of that enthusiastic confidence in the supreme wisdom of the adepts which the first approaches to occult study will generally evoke. Not that such enthusiasm or reverence will really be diminished on the part of any occult chela, as his comprehension of the world he is entering expands. The man who in one of his aspects is a Mahatma may rather be brought within the limits of affectionate human regard than deprived of his claims to reverence by the consideration that in his ordinary life he is not so utterly lifted above the commonplace run of human feeling as some of his nirvanic experiences might lead us to believe that he would be. If we keep constantly in mind that an adept is only truly an adept when exercising adept functions, but that when exercising adept functions, these he may soar into spiritual rapport with that which is, in regard at all events to the limitations of our solar system, all that we practically mean by omniscience. We shall then be guarded from many of the mistakes that the embarrassments of the subject might create. Intricacies concerning the nature of the adept may be noticed here, which will hardly be quite intelligible without reference to some later chapters of this book, but which have so important a bearing on all attempts to understand what adeptship is really like, that it may be convenient to deal with them at once. The dual nature of the Mahatma is so complete that some of his influence or wisdom on the higher planes of nature may actually be drawn upon by those in peculiar psychic relations with him, without the Mahatma man being at the moment even conscious that such an appeal has been made to him. In this way, it becomes open to us to speculate on the possibility that the relation between the spiritual Mahatma and the Mahatma man may sometimes be, rather in the nature of what is sometimes spoken of in esoteric writing, as an overshadowing, than as an incarnation, in the complete sense of the word. Furthermore, as another independent complication of the matter, we reach this fact, that each Mahatma is not merely a human ego in a very exalted state, but belongs, so to speak, to some specific department in the great economy of nature. Every adept must belong to one or other of 7 great types of adeptship, but although we may almost certainly infer that correspondences might be traced between these various types and the 7 principles of man, I should shrink myself from attempting a complete elucidation of this hypothesis. It will be enough to apply the idea to what we know vaguely of the occult organization in its higher regions. For some time past, it has been affirmed in esoteric writing that there are 5 great Chohans, or superior Mahatmas, presiding over the whole body of the adept fraternity. When the foregoing chapter of this book was written, I was under the impression that one supreme chief on a different level again exercised authority over these 5 Chohans, but it now appears to me that this personage may rather be regarded as a 6th Chohan, himself the head of the 6th type of Mahatmas, and this conjecture leads at once to the further inference that there must be a 7th Chohan to complete the correspondences which we thus discern. But just as the 7th principle in nature, or in man, is a conception of the most intangible order, eluding the grasp of any intellectual thinking, and only describable in shadowy phrases of metaphysical non-significance, so we may be quite sure that the 7th Chohan is very unapproachable by untrained imaginations. But even he no doubt plays a part in what may be called the higher economy of spiritual nature, and that there is such a personage visible occasionally. To some of the other Mahatmas I take to be the case, but speculation concerning him is valuable chiefly as helping to give consistency to the idea above thrown out, according to which the Mahatmas may be comprehended in their true aspect, as necessary phenomena of nature without whom the evolution of humanity could hardly be imagined as advancing, not as merely the exceptional men who have attained great spiritual exaltation. Chapter 2. The Constitution of Man, a survey of cosmogony, as comprehended by occult science, must precede any attempt to explain the means by which a knowledge of that cosmogony itself has been acquired. The methods of esoteric research have grown out of natural facts, with which exoteric science is wholly unacquainted. These natural facts are concerned with the premature development in occult adepts of faculties, which mankind at large has not yet evolved, and these faculties in turn enable their possessors to explore the mysteries of nature and verify the esoteric doctrines setting forth its grand design. The practical student of occultism may develop the faculties first and apply them to the observation of nature afterwards, but the exhibition of the theory of nature for Western readers merely seeking its intellectual comprehension must precede consideration of the inner senses which occult research employs. On the other hand, a survey of cosmogony, as comprehended by occult science, could only be scientifically arranged at the expense of intelligibility for European readers. To begin at the beginning, we should endeavor to realize the state of the universe before evolution sets in. This subject is by no means shirked by esoteric students, and later on, in the course of this sketch, some hints will be given concerning the views occultism entertains of the earlier processes through which cosmic matter passes on its way to evolution. But an orderly statement of the earliest processes of nature would embody references to man's spiritual constitution, which would not be understood without some preliminary explanation. 7 distinct principles are recognized by esoteric science as entering into the constitution of man. The classification differs so widely from any with which European readers will be familiar that I shall naturally be asked for the grounds on which occultism reaches so far-fetched a conclusion. But I must, on account of inherent peculiarities in the subject, which will be comprehended later on, beg for this Oriental knowledge I am bringing home. A hearing, in the first instance at all events, of the Oriental kind. The Oriental and the European systems of conveying knowledge are as unlike as any two methods can be. The West pricks and piques the learner's controversial instinct at every step. He is encouraged to dispute and resist conviction. He is forbidden to take any scientific statement on authority. Pari passu, as he acquires knowledge, he must learn how that knowledge has been acquired, and he is made to feel that no fact is worth knowing, unless he knows, with it, the way to prove it a fact. The East manages its pupils on a wholly different plan. It no more disregards the necessity of proving its teaching than the West, but it provides proof of a wholly different sort. It enables the student to search nature for himself and verify its teachings in those regions which Western philosophy can only invade by speculation and argument. It never takes the trouble to argue about anything. It says, so and so is fact. Here is the key of knowledge. Now go and see for yourself. In this way it comes to pass that teaching per se is never anything else but teaching on authority. Teaching and proof do not go hand in hand. They follow one another in due order. A further consequence of this method is that Eastern philosophy employs the method which we in the West have discarded for good reasons as incompatible with our own line of intellectual development, the system of reasoning from generals to particulars. The purposes which European science usually has in view would certainly not be answered by that plan, but I think that anyone who goes far in the present inquiry will feel that the system of reasoning up from the details of knowledge to general inferences is inapplicable to the work in hand. One cannot understand details in this department of knowledge till we get a general understanding of the whole scheme of things. Even to convey this general comprehension by mere language is a large and by no means an easy task. To pause at every moment of the exposition in order to collect what separate evidence may be available for the proof of each separate statement would be practically impossible. Such a method would break down the patience of the reader and prevent him from deriving, as he may from a more condensed treatise, that definite conception as to what the esoteric doctrine means to teach, which it is my business to evoke. This reflection may suggest, in passing, a new view, having an intimate connection with our present subject, of the Platonic and Aristotelian systems of reasoning. Plato's system, roughly described as reasoning from universals to particulars, is condemned by modern habits in favor of the later and exactly inverse system. But Plato was in fetters in attempting to defend his system. There is every reason to believe that his familiarity with esoteric science prompted his method, and that the usual restrictions under which he labored as an initiated occultist forbade him from saying as much as would really justify it. No one can study even as much occult science as this volume contains, and then turn to Plato, or even to any intelligent epitome of Plato's system of thought, without finding correspondences cropping out at every turn. The higher principles of the series, which go to constitute man, are not fully developed in the mankind with which we are as yet familiar, but a complete or perfect man would be resolvable into the following elements. To facilitate the application of these explanations to ordinary exoteric Buddhist writings, the Sanskrit names of these principles are given, as well as suitable terms in English. The nomenclature here adopted differs slightly from that hit upon when some of the present teachings were first given out in a fragmentary form in the Theosophist. Later on, it will be seen that the names now preferred embody a fuller conception of the whole system, and avoid some difficulties to which the earlier names give rise. If the earlier presentations of esoteric science were thus imperfect, one can hardly be surprised at so natural a consequence of the difficulties under which its English exponents labored. But no substantial errors have to be confessed or deplored. The connotations of the present names are more accurate than those of the phrases first selected, but the explanations originally given, as far as they went, were quite in harmony with those now developed. 1. The body, rupa. 2. Vitality, prana or jiva. 3. Astral body, linga, sharira. 4. Animal soul, kama, rupa. 5. Human soul, manas. 6. Spiritual soul, buddhi. 7. Spirit, atma. Directly conceptions, so transcendental as some of those included in this analysis, are set forth in a tabular statement. They seem to incur certain degradation, against which, in endeavoring to realize clearly what is meant, we must be ever on our guard. Certainly it would be impossible for even the most skillful professor of occult science to exhibit each of these principles separate and distinct from the others, as the physical elements of a compound body can be separated by analysis and preserved independently of each other. The elements of a physical body are all on the same plane of materiality, but the elements of man are on very different planes. The finest gases of which the body may to some extent be chemically composed are still, on one scale at all events, on nearly the lowest level of materiality. The second principle, which, by its union with gross matter, changes it from what we generally call inorganic, or what might more properly be called inert, into living matter, is at once a something different from the finest example of matter in its lower state. Is the second principle then anything that we can truly call matter at all? The question lands us, thus, at the very outset of this inquiry, in the middle of the subtle metaphysical discussion as to whether force and matter are different or identical. Enough for the moment to state that occult science regards them as identical, and that it contemplates no principle in nature as wholly immaterial. In this way, though no conceptions of the universe, of man's destiny, or of nature generally, are more spiritual than those of occult science, that science is wholly free from the logical error of attributing material results to immaterial causes. The esoteric doctrine is thus really the missing link between materialism and spirituality. The clue to the mystery involved lies, of course, in the fact, directly cognizable by occult experts, that matter exists in other states besides those which are cognizable by the five senses. The second principle of man, vitality, thus consists of matter in its aspect as force, and its affinity for the grosser state of matter is so great that it cannot be separated from any given particle or mass of this, except by instantaneous translation to some other particle or mass. When a man's body dies by desertion of the higher principles which have rendered it a living reality, the second, or life principle, no longer a unity itself, is nevertheless inherent still in the particles of the body as this decomposes, attaching itself to other organisms to which that very process of decomposition gives rise. Bury the body in the earth, and its jiva will attach itself to the vegetation which springs above, or the lower animal forms which evolve from its substance. Burn the body, and indestructible jiva flies back none the less instantaneously to the body of the planet itself from which it was originally borrowed, entering into some new combination as its affinities may determine. The third principle, the astral body, or linga sharira, is an ethereal duplicate of the physical body, its original design. It guides jiva in its work on the physical particles and causes it to build up the shape which these assume. Vitalized itself by the higher principles, its unity is only preserved by the union of the whole group. At death, it is disembodied for a brief period, and, under some abnormal conditions, may even be temporarily visible to the external sight of still living persons. Under such conditions, it is taken, of course, for the ghost of the departed person. Spectral apparitions may sometimes be occasioned in other ways, but the third principle, when that results in a visible phenomenon, is a mere aggregation of molecules in a peculiar state, having no life or consciousness of any kind whatever. It is no more a being than any cloud wreath in the sky which happens to settle into the semblance of some animal form. Broadly speaking, the linga sharira never leaves the body except at death, nor migrates far from the body even in that case. When seen at all, and this can but rarely occur, it can only be seen near where the physical body still lies. In some very peculiar cases of spiritualistic mediumship, it may for a short time exude from the physical body and be visible near it, but the medium in such cases stands the while in considerable danger of his life. Disturb unwillingly the conditions under which the linga sharira was set free, and its return might be impeded. The second principle would then soon cease to animate the physical body as a unity, and death would ensue. During the last year or two, while hints and scraps of occult science have been finding their way out into the world, the expression astral body has been applied to a certain semblance of the human form, fully inhabited by its higher principles, which can migrate to any distance from the physical body projected consciously and with exact intention by a living adept, or, unintentionally, by the accidental application of certain mental forces to his loosened principles by any person at the moment of death. For ordinary purposes, there is no practical inconvenience in using the expression astral body for the appearance to projected. Indeed, any more strictly accurate expression, as will be seen directly, would be cumbersome, and we must go on using the phrase in both meanings. No confusion need arise, but strictly speaking, the linga sharira, or third principle, is the astral body, and that cannot be sent about as the vehicle of the higher principles. The three lower principles, it will be seen, are altogether of the earth, perishable in their nature as a single entity, though indestructible as regards their molecules, and absolutely done with by man at his death. The fourth principle is the first of those which belong to man's higher nature. The Sanskrit designation, kama-rupa, is often translated body of desire, which seems rather a clumsy and inaccurate form of words. A closer translation, having regard to meanings rather than words, would, perhaps, be vehicle of will. but the name already adopted above, animal soul, may be more accurately suggestive still. In the Theosophist for October 1881, when the first hints about the septenary constitution of man were given out, the fifth principle was called the animal soul, as contradistinguished from the sixth or spiritual soul, but though this nomenclature sufficed to mark the required distinction, it degraded the fifth principle, which is essentially the human principle. Though humanity is animal in its nature as compared with spirit, it is elevated above the correctly defined animal creation in every other aspect. By introducing a new name for the fifth principle, we are enabled to throw back the designation animal soul to its proper place. This arrangement need not interfere, meanwhile, with an appreciation of the way in which the fourth principle is the seat of that will or desire to which the Sanskrit name refers. And, withal, the Kama Rupa is the animal soul, the highest developed principle of the brute creation, susceptible of evolution into something far higher by its union with the growing fifth principle in man, but still the animal soul which man is by no means yet without, the seat of all animal desires, and a potent force in the human body as well, pressing upwards, so to speak, as well as downwards, and capable of influencing the fifth for practical purposes, as well as of being influenced by the fifth for its own control and improvement. The fifth principle, human soul, or manas, as described in Sanskrit in one of its aspects, is the seat of reason and memory. It is a portion of this principle, animated by the fourth, which is really projected to distant places by an adept, when he makes an appearance in what is commonly called his astral body. Now, the fifth principle, or human soul, in the majority of mankind, is not even yet fully developed. This fact about the imperfect development as yet of the higher principles is very important. We cannot get a correct conception of the present place of man in nature if we make the mistake of regarding him as a fully perfected being already, and that mistake would be fatal to any reasonable anticipations concerning the future that awaits him, fatal also to any appreciation of the appropriateness of the future, which the esoteric doctrine explains to us as actually awaiting him. Since the fifth principle is not yet fully developed, it goes without saying that the sixth principle is still in embryo. This idea has been variously indicated in recent forecasts of the great doctrine. Sometimes it has been said, we do not truly possess any sixth principle, we merely have germs of a sixth principle. It has also been said, the sixth principle is not in us, it hovers over us. It is as something that the highest aspirations of our nature must work up towards. But it is also said, all things, not man alone, but every animal, plant, and mineral have their seven principles, and the highest principles of all, the seventh itself, vitalizes that continuous thread of life which runs all through evolution, uniting into a definite succession, the almost innumerable incarnations of that one life which constitute a complete series. We must imbibe all these various conceptions and weld them together or extract their essence to learn the doctrine of the sixth principle. Following the order of ideas which just now suggested the application of the term animal soul to the fourth principle and human soul to the fifth, the sixth may be called the spiritual soul of man, and the seventh, therefore, spirit itself. In another aspect of the idea, the sixth principle may be called the vehicle of the seventh, and the fourth the vehicle of the fifth, but yet another mode of dealing with. The problem teaches us to regard each of the higher principles from the fourth upwards as a vehicle of what, in Buddhist philosophy, is called the one life or spirit. According to this view of the matter of one life is that which perfects, by inhabiting the various vehicles. In the animal, the one life is concentrated in the Kama Rupa. In man it begins to penetrate the fifth principle as well. In perfected man it penetrates the sixth, and when it penetrates the seventh, man ceases to be man, and attains a wholly superior condition of existence. This latter view of the position is especially valuable as guarding against the notion that the four higher principles are like a bundle of sticks tied together, but each having individualities of their own if untied. Neither the animal soul alone, nor the spiritual soul alone, has any individuality at all, but, on the other hand, the fifth principle would be incapable of separation from the others in such a way that its individuality would be preserved while both the deserted principles would be left unconscious. It has been said that the finer principles themselves even are material and molecular in their constitution, though composed of a higher order of matter than the physical senses can take note of. So they are separable, and the sixth principle itself can be imagined as divorcing itself from its lower neighbor. But in that state of separation, and at this stage of mankind's development, it could simply reincarnate itself in such an emergency and grow a new fifth principle by contact with a human organism. In such a case, the fifth principle would lean upon and become one with the fourth, and be proportionately degraded. And yet, this fifth principle, which cannot stand alone, is the personality of the man, and its cream, in union with the sixth, his continuous individuality through successive lives, the circumstances and attractions under the influence of which the principles do divide up, and the manner in which the consciousness of man is dealt with then, will be discussed later on. Meanwhile, a better understanding of the whole position than could ensue from a continued prosecution of the inquiry on these lines now will be obtained by turning first to the processes of evolution by means of which the principles of man have been developed. Annotations. Some objection has been raised to the method in which the esoteric doctrine is presented to the reader in this book, on the ground that it is materialistic. I doubt if in any other way the ideas to be dealt with could so well be brought within the grasp of the mind, but it is easy when they once are grasped to translate them into terms of idealism. The higher principles will be the better susceptible of treatment as so many different states of the ego, when the attributes of these states have been separately considered as principles undergoing evolution. But it may be useful to dwell for a while on the view of the human constitution, according to which the consciousness of the entity migrates successively through the stages of development which the different principles represent. In the highest evolution we need concern ourselves with at present, that of the perfected Mahatma, it is sometimes asserted in occult teaching that the consciousness of the ego has acquired the power of residing altogether in the sixth principle. But it would be a gross view of the subject, and erroneous, to suppose that the Mahatma has on that account shaken off altogether, like a discarded sheath or sheaths, the fourth and fifth principles, in which his consciousness may have been seated during an earlier stage of his evolution. The entity, which was the fourth or fifth principle before, has come now to be different in its attributes and to be entirely divorced from certain tendencies or dispositions, and is, therefore, a sixth principle. The change can be spoken of in more general terms as an emancipation of the adept's nature from the enthrallments of his lower self, from desires of the ordinary earth life, even from the limitations of the affections, for the ego, which is entirely conscious in his sixth principle, has realized the unity of the true egos of all mankind on the higher plane, and can no longer be drawn by bonds of sympathy to any one more than to any other. He has attained that love of humanity as a whole which transcends the love of the Maya or illusion, which constitutes the separate human creature for the limited being on the lower levels of evolution. He has not lost his fourth and fifth principles. These have themselves attained Mahatmaship, just as the animal soul of the lower kingdom, in reaching humanity, has blossomed into the fifth state. That consideration helps us to realize more accurately the passage of ordinary human beings through the long series of incarnations of the human plane. Once fairly on that plane of existence, the consciousness of the primitive man gradually envelops the attributes of the fifth principle. But the ego at first remains a center of thought activity, working chiefly with impulses and desires of the fourth stage of evolution. Flashes of the higher human reason illumine it fitfully at first, but by degrees, the more intellectual man grows into the fuller possession of this. The impulses of human reason assert themselves more and more strongly. The invigorated mind becomes the predominant force in the life. Consciousness is transferred to the fifth principle, oscillating, however, between the tendencies of the lower and higher nature for a long while, that is to say, over vast periods of evolution and many hundred lives, and thus gradually purifying and exalting the ego. All this while the ego is thus a unity in one aspect of the matter, and its sixth principle, but a potentiality of ultimate development. As regards the seventh principle, that is the true unknowable, the supreme controlling cause of all things, which is the same for one man as for every man, the same for humanity as for the animal kingdom, the same for the physical as for the astral or devachanic or nirvanic planes of existence. No one man has got a seventh principle. In the higher conception of the subject, we are all in the same unfathomable way overshadowed by the seventh principle of the cosmos. How does this view of the subject harmonize with the statement in the foregoing chapter, that in a certain sense the principles are separable, and that the sixth even can be imagined as divorcing itself from its next lower neighbor, and, by reincarnation, as growing a new fifth principle by contact with a human organism? There is no incompatibility in the spirit of the two views. The seventh principle is one and indivisible in all nature, but there is a mysterious persistence through it of certain life impulses, which thus constitute threads on which successive existences may be strung. Such a life impulse does not expire even in the extraordinary case supposed, in which an ego, projected upon it and developed along it to a certain point, falls away from it. Altogether, and as a complete whole, I am not in a position to dogmatize with precision as to what happens in such a case, but the subsequent incarnations of the spirit along that line of impulse are clearly of the original sequence, and thus in the materialistic treatment of the idea, it may be said, with as much approach to accuracy as language will allow in either mode, that the sixth principle of the fallen entity in such a case separates itself from the original fifth, and reincarnates on its own account. But with these abnormal processes, it is unnecessary to occupy ourselves to any great extent. The normal evolution is the problem we have first to solve, and while the consideration of the seven principles as such is, to my own mind, the most instructive method by which the problem can be dealt with, it is well to remember always that the ego is a unity progressing through various spheres or states of being, undergoing change and growth and purification all through the course of its evolution, that it is a consciousness seated in this or that or the other of the potential attributes of a human entity. Chapter 3. The Planetary Chain. Esoteric science, though the most spiritual system imaginable, exhibits as running throughout nature the most exhaustive system of evolution that the human mind can conceive. The Darwinian theory of evolution is simply an independent discovery of a portion, unhappily but a small portion, of the vast natural truth. But occultists know how to explain evolution without degrading the highest principles of man. The esoteric doctrine finds itself under no obligation to keep its science and religion in separate watertight compartments. Its theory of physics and its theory of spirituality are not only reconcilable with each other, they are intimately blended together and interdependent. And the first great fact which occult science presents to our notice in reference to the origin of man on this globe will be seen to help the imagination over some serious embarrassments of the familiar scientific idea of evolution. The evolution of man is not a process carried out on this planet alone. It is a result to which many worlds in different conditions of material and spiritual development have contributed. If this statement were merely put forward as a conjecture, it would surely recommend itself forcibly to rational minds, for there is a manifest irrationality in the commonplace notion that man's existence is divided into a material beginning, lasting 60 or 70 years, and a spiritual remainder lasting forever. The irrationality amounts to absurdity when it is alleged that the acts of the 60 or 70 years, the blundering, helpless acts of ignorant, human life, are permitted by the perfect justice of an all-wise providence to define the conditions of that later life of infinite duration. Nor is it less extravagant to imagine that, apart from the question of justice, the life beyond the grave should be exempt from the law of change, progress, and improvement, which every analogy of nature points to as probably running through all the varied existences of the universe. But once abandon the idea of a uniform, unvarying, unprogressive life beyond the grave, once admit the conception of change and progress in that life, and we admit the idea of a variety hardly compatible with any other hypothesis than that of progress through successive worlds. As we have said before, this is not a hypothesis at all for occult science, but a fact, ascertained and verified beyond the reach for occultists of doubt or contradiction. The life and evolutionary processes of this planet, in fact, all which constitutes it something more than a dead lump of chaotic matter, are linked with the life and evolutionary processes of several other planets. But let it not be supposed that there is no finality as regards the scheme of this planetary union to which we belong. The human imagination, once set free, is apt sometimes to bound too far. Once let this notion, that the Earth is merely one link in a mighty chain of worlds, be fully accepted as probable or true, and it may suggest the whole starry heavens as the heritage of the human family. That idea would involve a serious misconception. One globe does not afford nature scope for the processes by which mankind has been evoked from chaos, but these processes do not require more than a limited and definite number of globes. Separated as these are, in regard to the gross mechanical matter of which they consist, they are closely and intimately bound together by subtle currents and forces, whose existence reason need not be much troubled to concede, since the existence of some connection of force or ethereal media, uniting all visible celestial bodies, is proved by the mere fact that they are visible. It is along these subtle currents that the life elements pass from world to world. The fact, however, will at once be liable to distortion to suit preconceived habits of mind. Some readers may imagine our meaning to be that after death, the surviving soul will be drawn into the currents of that world with which its affinities connect it. The real process is more methodical. The system of worlds is a circuit round which all individual spiritual entities have alike to pass, and that passage constitutes the evolution of man. For it must be realized that the evolution of man is a process still going on, and by no means yet complete. Darwinian writings have taught the modern world to regard the ape as an ancestor, but the simple conceit of Western speculation has rarely permitted European evolutionists to look in the other direction and recognize the probability that to our remote descendants we may be, as that unwelcome progenitor to us. Yet the two facts just declared hinge together. The higher evolution will be accomplished by our progress through the successive worlds of the system, and in higher forms we shall return to this earth again and again. But the avenues of thought through which we look forward to this prospect are of almost inconceivable length. It will readily be supposed that the chain of worlds to which this earth belongs are not all prepared for a material existence exactly, or even approximately resembling our own. There would be no meaning in an organized chain of worlds which were all alike, and might as well all have been amalgamated into one. In reality, the worlds with which we are connected are very unlike each other, not merely in outward conditions, but in that supreme characteristic, the proportion in which spirit and matter are mingled in their constitution. Our own world presents us with conditions in which spirit and matter are on the whole evenly balanced in equilibrium. Let it not be supposed on that account that it is very highly elevated in the scale of perfection. On the contrary, it occupies a very low place in that scale. The worlds that are higher in the scale are those in which spirit largely predominates. There is another world attached to the chain, rather than forming a part of it, in which matter asserts itself even more decisively than on earth, but this may be spoken of later. That the superior worlds which man may come to inhabit in his onward progress should gradually become more and more spiritual in their constitution, life there being more and more successfully divorced from gross material needs, will seem reasonable enough at the first glance. But the first glance in imagination at those which might conversely be called the inferior, but may with less inaccuracy be spoken of as the preceding worlds, would perhaps suggest that they ought to be conversely less spiritual, more material than this earth. The fact is quite the other way, and must be so. It will be seen on reflection, in a chain of worlds which is an endless chain, that is round and round which the evolutionary process travels. If that process had merely one journey to travel along a path which never returned into itself, one could think of it at any rate as working from almost absolute matter up to almost absolute spirit, but nature works always in complete curves, and travels always in paths which return into themselves. The earliest, as also the latest developed worlds, for the chain itself has grown by degrees, the furthest back, as also the furthest forward, are the most immaterial, the most ethereal of the whole series, and that this is in all ways in accordance with the fitness of things will appear from the reflection that the furthest forward of the worlds is not a region of finality, but the stepping stone to the furthest back, as the month of December leads us back again to January. But it is not a climax of development from which the individual monad falls, as by a catastrophe, into the state from which he slowly began to ascend millions of years previously. From that which, for reasons which will soon appear, must be considered the highest world on the ascending arc of the circle, to that which must be regarded as the first on the descending arc, in one sense the lowest, that is in the order of development, there is no descent at all, but still ascent and progress. For the spiritual monad or entity, which has worked its way all round the cycle of evolution at any one of the many stages of development into which the various existences around us may be grouped, begins its next cycle at the next higher stage, and is thus still accomplishing progress as it passes from world Z back again to world A. Many times does it circle in this way right round the system, but its passage round must not be thought of merely as a circular revolution in an orbit. In the scale of spiritual perfection, it is constantly ascending. Thus, if we compare the system of worlds to a system of towers standing on a plain, towers each of many stories and symbolizing the scale of perfection, the spiritual monad performs a spiral progress round and round the series, passing through each tower, every time it comes round to it, at a higher level than before. It is for want of realizing this idea that speculation concerned with physical evolution is so constantly finding itself stopped by dead walls. It is searching for its missing links in a world where it can never find them now, for they were but required for a temporary purpose and have passed away. Man, says the Darwinian, was once an ape. Quite true, but the ape known to the Darwinian will never become a man. That is, the form will not change from generation to generation till the tail disappears and the hands turn into feet, and so on. Ordinary science avows that, though changes of form can be detected in progress within the limits of species, the changes from species to species can only be inferred, and to account for these, it is content to assume great intervals of time and the extinction of the intermediate forms. There has been no doubt an extinction of the intermediate or earlier forms of all species in the larger acceptation of the word, that is, of all kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, animal, man, etc. But ordinary science can merely guess, that to have been the fact without realizing the conditions which rendered it inevitable, and which forbid the renewed generation of the intermediate forms. It is the spiral character of the progress accomplished by the life impulses that develop the various kingdoms of nature, which accounts for the gaps now observed in the animated forms which people the earth. The thread of a screw, which is a uniform inclined plane in reality, looks like a succession of steps when examined only along one line parallel to its axis. The spiritual monads, which are coming round the system on the animal level, pass on to other worlds when they have performed their turn of animal incarnation here. By the time they come again, they are ready for human incarnation, and there is no necessity now for the upward development of animal forms into human forms. These are already waiting for their spiritual tenants. But, if we go back far enough, we come to a period at which there were no human forms ready developed on the earth, when spiritual monads, traveling on the earliest or lowest human level, were thus beginning to come round, their onward pressure in a world at that. Time containing none but animal forms provoked the improvement of the highest of these into the required form, the much talked of missing link. In one way of looking at the matter, it may be contended that this explanation is identical with the inference of the Darwinian evolutionist in regard to the development and extinction of missing links. After all, it may be argued by a materialist, we are not concerned to express an opinion as to the origin of the tendency in species to develop higher forms. We say that they do develop these higher forms by intermediate links, and that the intermediate links die out, and you say just the same thing. But there is a distinction between the two ideas for anyone who can follow subtle distinctions. The natural process of evolution from the influence of local circumstances and sexual selection must not be credited with producing intermediate forms. And this is why it is inevitable that the intermediate forms should be of a temporary nature and should die out. Otherwise, we should find the world stocked with missing links of all kinds. Animal life creeping by plainly apparent degrees up to manhood. Human forms mingling in indistinguishable confusion with those of animals. The impulse to the new evolution of higher forms is really given, as we have shown by rushes of spiritual monads coming round the cycle, in a state fit for the inhabitation of new forms. These superior life impulses burst the chrysalis of the older form on the planet they invade, and throw off an efflorescence of something higher. The forms which have gone on merely repeating themselves for millenniums start afresh into growth. With relative rapidity they rise through the intermediate into the higher forms, and then, as these in turn are multiplied with the vigor and rapidity of all new growths, they supply tenements of flesh for the spiritual entities coming round on that state or plane of existence, and for the intermediate forms there are no longer any tenants offering. Inevitably they become extinct. Thus is evolution accomplished, as regards its essential impulse, by a spiral progress through the worlds. In the course of explaining this idea, we have partly anticipated the declaration of another fact of first-rate importance as an aid to correct views of the world system to which we belong. That is, that the tide of life, the wave of existence, the spiritual impulse, call it by what name we please, passes on from planet to planet by rushes or gushes, not by an even continuous flow. For the momentary purpose of illustrating the idea in hand, the process may be compared to the filling of a series of holes or tubs sunk in the ground, such as may sometimes be seen at the mouths of feeble springs, and connected with each other by little surface channels. The stream from the spring, as it flows, is gathered up entirely in the beginning by the first hole, or tub A, and it is only when this is quite full that the continued inpouring of water from the spring causes that which it already contains to overflow into tub B. This in turn fills and overflows along the channel which leads to tub C, and so on. Now, though of course a clumsy analogy of this kind will not carry us very far, it precisely illustrates the evolution of life on a chain of worlds like that we are attached to, and indeed the evolution of the worlds themselves. For the process which goes on does not involve the pre-existence of a chain of globes which nature proceeds to stock with life, but it is one in which the evolution of each globe is the result of previous evolutions, and the consequence of certain impulses thrown off from its predecessor in the superabundance of their development. Now, it is necessary to deal with this characteristic of the process to be described, but directly we begin to deal with it, we have to go back in imagination to a period in the development of our system, very far antecedent to that which is specially our subject at present, the evolution of man. And manifestly, as soon as we begin talking of the beginnings of worlds, we are dealing with phenomena which can have had very little to do with life, as we understand the matter, and, therefore, it may be supposed, nothing to do with life impulses. But let us go back by degrees. Behind the human harvest of the life impulse, there lay the harvest of mere animal forms, as everyone realizes. Behind that, the harvest or growths of mere vegetable forms, for some of these undoubtedly preceded the appearance of the earliest animal life on the planet. Then, before the vegetable organizations, there were mineral organizations. For even a mineral is a product of nature, an evolution from something. Behind it, as every imaginable manifestation of nature must be, until in the vast series of manifestations, the mind travels back to the unmanifested beginning of all things. On pure metaphysics of that sort, we are not now engaged. It is enough to show that we may as reasonably, and that we must, if we would talk about these matters at all, conceive a life, impulse giving birth to mineral forms, as of the same sort of impulse concerned to raise a race of apes into a race of rudimentary men. Indeed, occult science travels back even further in its exhaustive analysis of evolution than the period at which minerals began to assume existence. In the process of developing worlds from fiery nebulae, nature begins with something earlier than minerals, with the elemental forces that underlie the phenomena of nature as visible now and perceptible to the senses of man. But that branch of the subject may be left alone for the present. Let us take up the process at the period when the first world of the series, globe let us call it, is merely a congeries of mineral forms. Now it must be remembered that globe A has already been described as very much more ethereal, more predominated by spirit as distinguished from matter than the globe of what we at present are. Having personal experience, so that a large allowance must be made for that state of things, when we ask the reader to think of it, at starting, as a mere congeries of mineral forms. Mineral forms may be mineral in the sense of not belonging to the higher forms of vegetable organism, and may yet be very immaterial as we think of matter, very ethereal, consisting of a very fine or subtle quality of matter, in which the other pole or characteristic of nature, spirit, largely predominates. The minerals we are trying to portray are, as it were, the ghosts of minerals, by no means the highly finished and beautiful, hard crystals which the mineralogical cabinets of this world supply. In these lower spirals of evolution with which we are now dealing, as with the higher ones, there is progress from world to world, and that is the great point at which we have been aiming. There is progress downwards, so to speak, in finish and materiality and consistency, and then, again, progress upward in spirituality, as coupled with the finish which matter or materiality rendered possible in the first instance. It will be found that the process of evolution in its higher stages as regards man is carried on in exactly the same way. All through these studies, indeed, it will be found that one process of nature typifies another, that the big is the repetition of the little on a larger scale. It is manifest from what we have already said, and in order that the progress of organisms on globe A shall be accounted for, that the mineral kingdom will no more develop the vegetable kingdom on globe A until it receives an impulse from without, than the earth was able to develop man from the ape till it received an impulse from without. But it will be inconvenient at present to go back to a consideration of the impulses which operate on globe A in the beginning of the system's construction. We have already, in order to be able to advance more comfortably from a far later period than that to which we have now receded, gone back so far that further recession would change the whole character of this explanation. We must stop somewhere, and for the present, it will be best to take the life impulses behind globe A for granted. And having stopped there, we may now treat the enormous period intervening between the mineral epoch on globe A and the man epoch in a very cursory way, and so get back to the main problem before us. What has been already said facilitates a cursory treatment of the intervening evolution. The full development of the mineral epoch on globe A prepares the way for the vegetable development. As soon as this begins, the mineral life impulse overflows into globe B. Then, when the vegetable development on globe A is complete and the animal development begins, the vegetable life impulse overflows to globe B, and the mineral impulse passes on to globe C. Then, finally, comes the human life impulse on globe A. Now, it is necessary at this point to guard against one misconception that might arise. As just roughly described, the process might convey the idea that by the time the human impulse began on globe A, the mineral impulse was then beginning on globe D, and that beyond lay chaos. This is very far from being the case, for two reasons. Firstly, as already stated, there are processes of evolution which precede the mineral evolution, and thus a wave of evolution, indeed several waves of evolution, precede the mineral wave in its progress round the spheres. But over and above this, there is a fact to be stated which has such an influence on the course of events that, when it is realized, it will be seen that the life impulse has passed several times completely round the whole chain of worlds before the commencement of the human impulse on globe A. This fact is as follows. Each kingdom of evolution, vegetable, animal, and so on, is divided into several spiral layers. The spiritual monads, The individual atoms of that immense life impulse of which so much has been said do not fully complete their mineral existence on globe A, then complete it on globe B, and so on. They pass several times round the whole circle as minerals, and then again several times round as vegetables, and several times as animals. We purposely refrain for the present from going into figures, because it is more convenient to state the outline of the scheme in general terms first. But figures in reference to these processes of nature have now been given to the world by the occult adepts for the first time, we believe, and they shall be brought out in the course of this explanation very shortly. But, as we say, the outline is enough for anyone to think of at first. And now we have rudimentary man beginning his existence on globe A, in that world where all things are as the ghosts of the corresponding things in this world. He is beginning his long descent into matter, and the life impulse of each round overflows, and the races of man are established in different degrees of perfection on all the planets, on each in turn. But the rounds are more complicated in their design than this explanation would show, if it stopped short here. The process for each spiritual monad is not merely a passage from planet to planet. Within the limits of each planet, each time it arrives there, it has a complicated process of evolution to perform. It is many times incarnated in successive races of men before it passes onward, and it even has many incarnations in each great race. It will be found when we get on further that this fact throws a flood of light upon the actual condition of mankind as we know it, accounting for those immense differences of intellect and morality, and even of welfare in its highest sense, which generally appears so painfully mysterious. That which has a definite beginning generally has an end also, as we have shown that the evolutionary process under description began when certain impulses first commenced their operation. So it may be inferred that they are tending towards a final consummation, towards a goal and a conclusion. That is so, though the goal is still far off. Man, as we know him on this earth, is but halfway through the evolutionary process to which he owes his present development. He will be as much greater before the destiny of our system is accomplished than he is now, as he is now greater than the missing link, and that improvement will even be accomplished on this earth, while, in the other worlds of the ascending series, there are still loftier peaks of perfection to be scaled. It is utterly beyond the range of faculties untutored in the discernment of occult mysteries to imagine the kind of life which man will thus ultimately lead before the zenith of the great cycle is attained. But there is enough to be done in filling up the details of the outline now presented to the reader, without attempting to forecast those which have to do with existences towards which evolution is reaching across the enormous abysses of the future. Annotations. An expression occurs in the foregoing chapter which does not recommend itself to the somewhat fuller conceptions I've been able to form of the subject since this book was written. It is stated that the spiritual monads, the individual atoms of that immense life impulse of which so much has been said, do not fully complete their mineral existence on globe A, then complete it on globe B, and so on. They pass several times round the whole circle as minerals, and then again several times round as vegetables, etc. Now, it is intelligible to me that I was permitted to use this form of expression in the first instance because the main purpose in view was to elucidate the way in which the human entity was gradually evolved from processes of nature going on in the first instance in lower kingdoms. But in truth, at a later stage of the inquiry, it becomes manifest that the vast process of which the evolution of humanity and all which that leads up to is the crowning act, the descent of spirit into matter, does not bring about a differentiation of individualities until a much later stage than is contemplated in the passage just quoted. In the mineral worlds on which the higher forms of plant and animal life have not yet been established, there is no such thing, as yet, as an individual spiritual monad, unless indeed by virtue of some inconceivable unity, inconceivable, but subject to treatment as a theory nonetheless, in the life impulses which are destined to give rise to the later chains of highly organized existence. Just as in a preceding note, we assume the unity of such a life impulse in the case of a perverted human ego falling away as a whole from the current of evolution on which it was launched, so we may assume the same unity backwards to the earliest beginnings of the planetary chain. But this can be no more than a protective hypothesis, reserving us the right to investigate some mysteries later on that we need not go into at present. For a general appreciation of the subject, it is better to regard the first infusion, as it were, of spirit into matter as provoking a homogeneous manifestations. The specific forms of the mineral kingdom, the crystals and differentiated rocks, are but bubbles in the seething mass, assuming partially individualized forms for a time and rushing again into the general substance of the growing cosmos, not yet true individualities. Nor even in the vegetable kingdom does individuality set in. The vegetable establishes organic matter in physical manifestation, and prepares the way for the higher evolution of the animal kingdom. In this, for the first time, but only in the higher regions of this, is true individuality evoked. Therefore, it is not till we begin in imagination to contemplate the passage of the great life impulse round the planetary chain on the level of animal incarnation, that it would be strictly justifiable to speak of the spiritual monads as traveling round the circle as a plurality, to which the word they would properly apply. It is evidently not with the intention of encouraging any close study of evolution on the very grand scale with which we are dealing here that the adept authors of the doctrine set forth in this volume have opened the subject of the planetary chain. As far as humanity is concerned, the period during which this earth will be occupied by our race is more than long enough to absorb all our speculative energy. The magnitude of the evolutionary process to be accomplished during that period is more than enough to tax to the utmost the capacities of an ordinary imagination. But it is extremely advantageous for students of the occult doctrine to realize the plurality of worlds in our system once for all, their intimate relations with, their interdependence on each other, before concentrating attention on the evolution of this single planet. 4. In many respects, the evolution of a single planet follows a routine, as it will be found directly, that bears an analogical resemblance to the routine affecting the entire series of planets to which it belongs. The older writings on occult science, of the obscurely worded order, sometimes refer to successive states of one world, as if successive worlds were meant, and vice versa. Confusion thus arises in the reader's mind, and according to the bent of his own inclination, he clings to various interpretations of the misty language. The obscurity disappears when we realize that in the actual facts of nature, we have to recognize both courses of change. Each planet, while inhabited by humanity, goes through metamorphoses of a highly important and impressive character, the effect of which may in each case be almost regarded as equivalent to the reconstitution of the world. But nonetheless, if the whole group of such changes is treated as a unity, does it form one of a higher series of changes? The several worlds of the chain are objective realities, and not symbols of change in one single variable world. Further remarks on this head will fall into their place more naturally at the close of a later chapter. Chapter 4. The World Periods. A striking illustration of the uniformities of nature is brought out by the first glance at the occult doctrine in reference to the development of man on the earth. The outline of the design is the same as the outline of the more comprehensive design covering the whole chain of worlds. The inner details of this world, as regards its units of construction, are the same as the inner details of the larger organism of which this world itself is a unit. That is to say, the development of humanity on this earth is accomplished by means of successive waves of development which correspond to the successive worlds in the great planetary chain. The great tide of human life, be it remembered, for that has been already set forth, sweeps round the whole circle of worlds in successive waves. These primary growths of humanity may be conveniently spoken of as rounds. We must not forget that the individual units constituting each round in turn are identically the same as regards their higher principles, that is, that the individualities on the earth during round 1 come back again after completing their travels round the whole series of worlds and constitute round 2, and so on. But the point to which special attention should be drawn here is that the individual unit, having arrived at any given planet of the series in the course of any given round, does not merely touch that planet and pass on to the next. Before passing on, he has to live through a series of races on that planet. And this fact suggests the outline of the fabric which will presently develop itself in the reader's mind and exhibit that similarity of design on the part of one world as compared with the whole series, to which attention has already been drawn. As the complete scheme of nature that we belong to is worked out by means of a series of rounds sweeping through all the worlds, so the development of humanity on each world is worked out by a series of races developed within the limits of each world in turn. It is time now to make the working of this law clearer by coming to the actual figures which have to do with the evolution of our doctrine. It would have been premature to begin with them, but as soon as the idea of a system of worlds in a chain and of life evolution on each through a series of rebirths is satisfactorily grasped, the further examination of the laws at work will be greatly facilitated by precise reference to the actual number of worlds and the actual number of rounds and races required to accomplish the whole purpose of the system. For the whole duration of the system is as certainly limited in time, be it remembered, as the life of a single man. Probably not limited to any definite number of years set irrevocably from the commencement, but that which has a beginning progresses onward towards an end. The life of a man, leaving accidents quite out of the account, is a terminable period, and the life of a world system leads up to a final consummation. The vast periods of time concerned in the life of a world system, dazzle the imagination as a rule, but still they are measurable. They are divisible into sub-periods of various kinds, and these have a definite number. By what prophetic instinct Shakespeare pitched upon 7 as the number which suited his fantastic classification of the ages of man is a question with which we need not be much concerned, but certain it is that he could not have made a more felicitous choice. In periods of 7s, the evolution of the races of man may be traced, and the actual number of the objective worlds which constitute our system, and of which the Earth is one, is 7 also. Remember, the occult scientists know this as a fact, just as the physical scientists know for a fact that the spectrum consists of 7 colors and the musical scale of 7 tones. There are 7 kingdoms of nature, not 3, as modern science has imperfectly classified them. Man belongs to a kingdom distinctly separate from that of the animals, including beings in a higher state of organization than that which manhood has familiarized us with as yet, and below the mineral kingdom there are 3 others, which science in the West knows nothing about, but this branch of the subject may be set aside for the present. It is mentioned merely to show the regular operation of the septenary law in nature. Man, returning to the kingdom we are most interested in, is evolved in a series of progressions round the series of worlds, and 7 of these rounds have to be accomplished before the destinies of our system are worked out. The round which is at present going on is the 4th. There are considerations of the utmost possible interest connected with precise knowledge on these points, because each round is, as it were, specially allotted to the predominance of one of the 7 principles in man and in the regular order of their upward gradation. An individual unit, arriving on a planet for the first time in the course of a round, has to work through 7 races on that planet before he passes on to the next, and each of those races occupies the Earth for a long time. Our old-fashioned speculations about time and eternity, suggested by the misty religious systems of the West, have brought on a curious habit of mind in connection with problems bearing on the actual duration of such periods. We can talk glibly of eternity, and, going to the other end of the scale, we are not shocked by a few thousand years, but directly years are numbered with precision in groups which lie in intervening regions of thought. Illogical Western theologians are apt to regard such numbering as nonsense. Now, we at present living on this earth, the great bulk of humanity, that is to say, for there are exceptional cases to be considered later, are now going through the 5th race of our present 4th round. And yet the evolution of that 5th race began about 1 million of years ago. Will the reader, in consideration of the fact that the present cosmogony does not profess to work with eternity, nerve himself to deal with estimates that do concern themselves with millions of years, and even count such millions by considerable numbers? Each race of the 7 which go to make up a round, that is, which are evolved on the Earth in succession during its occupation by the great wave of humanity passing round the planetary chain, is itself subject to subdivision. Were this not the case, the active existences of each human unit would be indeed few and far between. Within the limits of each race there are 7 subdivisional races, and again within the limits of each subdivision there are 7 branch races. Through all these races, roughly speaking, each individual human unit must pass during his stay on Earth, each time he arrives there, on a round of progress through the planetary system. On reflection, this necessity should not appall the mind so much as a hypothesis which would provide for fewer incarnations. For, however many lives each individual unit may pass through whole on Earth during a round, be their numbers few or many, he cannot pass on until the time comes for the round wave to sweep forward. Even by the calculation already foreshadowed, it will be seen that the time spent by each individual unit in physical life can only be a small fraction of the whole time he has to get through between his arrival on Earth and his departure for the next planet. The larger part of the time, as we reckon duration of time, is obviously, therefore, spent in those subjective conditions of existence which belong to the world of effects, or spiritual Earth attached to the physical Earth, on which our objective existence is passed. The nature of existence on the spiritual Earth must be considered pari passu with the nature of that passed on the physical Earth and dealt with in the above enumeration of race incarnations. We must never forget that between each physical existence, the individual unit passes through a period of existence in the corresponding spiritual world. And it is because the conditions of that existence are defined by the use that has been made of the opportunities in the next, preceding physical existence, that the spiritual Earth is often spoken of in occult writing as the world of effects. The Earth itself is its corresponding world of causes. That which passes naturally into the world of effects after an incarnation in the world of causes is the individual unit or spiritual monad, but the personality just dissolved passes there with it. to an extent dependent on the qualifications of such personality, on the use, that is to say, which the person in question has made of his opportunities in life. The period to be spent in the world of effects, enormously longer in each case than the life which has paved the way for existence there, corresponds to the hereafter or heaven of ordinary theology. The narrow purview of ordinary religious conceptions deals merely with one spiritual life and its consequences in the life to come. Theology conceives that the entity concerned had its beginning in this physical life, and that the ensuing spiritual life will never stop. And this pair of existences, which is shown by the elements of occult science that we are now unfolding, to constitute a part only of the entity's experience during its connection with a branch race which is one of 7 belonging to a subdivisional race, itself one of 7 belonging to a main race, itself one of 7 belonging to the occupation of Earth, by one of the 7 round waves of humanity, which have each to occupy it in turn before its functions in nature are concluded. This microscopic molecule of the whole structure is what common theology treats as more than the whole, for it is supposed to cover eternity. The reader must here be warned against one conclusion to which the above explanations, perfectly accurate as far as they go, but not yet covering the whole ground, might lead him. He will not get at the exact number of lives an individual entity has to lead on the earth in the course of its occupation by one round, if he merely raises 7 to its 3rd power. If one existence only were passed in each branch race, the total number would obviously be 343. But each life descends at least twice into objectivity in the same branch. Each monad, in other words, incarnates twice in each branch race. Again, there is a curious cyclic law which operates to augment the total number of incarnations beyond 686. Each subdivisional race has a certain extra vitality at its climax, which leads it to throw off an additional offshoot race at that point in its progress. And again, another offshoot race is developed at the end of the subdivisional race by its dying momentum, so to speak. Through these races, the whole tide of human life passes, and the result is that the actual normal number of incarnations for each monad is not far short of 800. Within relatively narrow limits, it is a variable number, but the bearings of that fact may be considered later on. The methodical law which carries each and every individual human entity through the vast evolutionary process thus sketched out is in no way incompatible with that liability to fall away into abnormal destinies or ultimate annihilation which menaces the personal entities of people who cultivate very ignoble affinities. The distribution of the 7 principles at death shows that clearly enough, but viewed in the light of these further explanations about evolution, the situation may be better realized. The permanent entity is that which lives through the whole series of lives, not only through the races belonging to the present round wave on Earth, but also through those of other round waves and other worlds. Broadly speaking, it may, in due time, though at some inconceivably distant future, as measured in years, recover a recollection of all those lives, which will seem as days in the past to us. But the astral dross, cast off at each passage into the world of effects, has a more or less independent existence of its own, quite separate from that of the spiritual entity from which it has just been disunited. The natural history of this astral remnant is a problem of much interest and importance, but a methodical continuation of the whole subject will require us in the first instance to endeavor to realize the destiny of the higher and more durable spiritual ego. And before going into that inquiry, there is a good deal more to be said about the development of the objective races. Esoteric science, though interesting itself mainly with matters generally regarded as appertaining to religion, would not be the complete, comprehensive, and trustworthy system that it is, if it failed to bring all the facts of earth life into harmony with its doctrines. It would have been little able to search out and ascertain the manner in which the human race has evolved through eons of time and series of planets, if it had not been in a position to ascertain also, as the smaller inquiry is included in the greater, the manner in which the wave of humanity with which we are now concerned has been developed on this earth. The faculties, in short, which enable adepts to read the mysteries of other worlds and of other states of existence, are in no way unequal to the task of traveling back along the life current of this globe. It follows that while the brief record of a few thousand years is all that our so-called universal history can deal with, the Earth history, which forms a department of esoteric knowledge, goes back to the incidents of the 4th race, which preceded ours, and to those of the 3rd race, which preceded that. It goes back still further indeed, but the 2nd and 1st races did not develop anything that could be called civilization, and of them, therefore, there is less to be said than of their successors. The 3rd and 4th did, strange as it may seem to some modern readers to contemplate the notion of civilization on the Earth several millions of years ago. Where are its traces? They will ask. How could the civilization with which Europe has now endowed mankind pass away so completely that any future inhabitants of the Earth could ever be ignorant that it once existed? How then can we conceive the idea that any similar civilization can have vanished, leaving no records for us? The answer lies in a regular routine of planetary life, which goes on pari passu with the life of its inhabitants. The periods of the great root races are divided from each other by great convulsions of nature and by great geological changes. Europe was not in existence as a continent at the time the fourth race flourished. The continent on which the fourth race lived was not in existence at the time the third race flourished. And neither of the continents, which were the great vortices of the civilizations of these two races, are in existence now. 7 great continental cataclysms occur during the occupation of the Earth by the human life wave for one round period. Each race is cut off in this way at its appointed time, some survivors remaining in parts of the world not the proper home of their race, but these, invariably in such cases, exhibiting a tendency to decay and relapsing into barbarism with more or less rapidity. The proper home of the fourth race, which directly preceded our own, was that continent of which some memory has been preserved even in exoteric literature, the lost Atlantis. But the great island, the destruction of which is spoken of by Plato, was really but the last remnant of the continent. In the Eocene age, I am told, even in its very first part, the great cycle of the fourth racemen, the Atlanteans, had already reached its highest point, and the great continent, the father of nearly all the present continents, showed the first symptoms of sinking, a process that occupied it down to 11,446 years ago, when its last island, that, translating its vernacular name we may call with propriety Poseidonis, went down with a crash. Lemuria, a former continent stretching southwards from India across what is now the Indian Ocean, but connected with Atlantis for Africa, was not then in existence. Should no more be confounded with the Atlantis continent than Europe with America. Both sank and were drowned, with their high civilizations and gods, yet between the two catastrophes, a period of about 700,000 years elapsed, Lemuria flourishing and ending her career, just about that lapse of time before the early part of the Eocene age, since its race was the third. Behold the relics of that once great nation in some of the flat-headed aborigines of your Australia. It is a mistake on the part of a recent writer on Atlantis to people India and Egypt with the colonies of that continent. But of that more anon. Why should not your geologists, asks my revered Mahatma teacher, bear in mind that under the continents explored and fathomed by them, in the bowels of which they have found the Eocene age and forced it to deliver them its secrets, there may be hidden deep in the fathomless, or rather unfathomed, ocean beds, other and far older continents whose strata have never been geologically explored, and that they may someday upset entirely their present theories. Why not admit that our present continents have, like Lemuria and Atlantis, been several times already submerged, and had the time to reappear again and bear their new groups of mankind and civilization, and that at the first great geological upheaval at the next cataclysm, in the series of periodical cataclysms that occur from the beginning to the end of every round, our already autopsized continents will go down, and the Lemurias and Atlantises come up again? Of course, the fourth race had its periods of the highest civilization. The letter from which I am now quoting was written in answer to a series of questions I put. Greek and Roman, and even Egyptian civilizations are nothing compared to the civilizations that began with the third race. Those of the second race were not savages, but they could not be called civilized. Greeks and Romans were small sub-races, and Egyptians part and parcel of our own Caucasian stock. Look at the latter, and at India. Having reached the highest civilization, and, what is more, learning, both went down, Egypt as a distinct sub-race, disappearing entirely, her Copts are but a hybrid remnant, India as one, of the first and most powerful offshoots of the mother race, and composed of a number of sub-races, lasting to these times, and struggling to take once more her place in history someday. That history catches but a few stray, hazy glimpses of Egypt some 12,000 years back, when, having already reached the apex of its cycle thousands of years before, the latter had begun to go down. The Chaldees were at the apex of their occult fame before what you term the Bronze Age. We hold, but then what warrant can you give the world that we are right? That far greater civilizations than our own have risen and decayed? It is not enough to say, as some of your modern writers do, that an extinct civilization existed before Rome and Athens were founded. We affirm that a series of civilizations existed before, as well as after the glacial period, that they existed upon various points of the globe, reached the apex of glory, and died. Every trace and memory had been lost of the Assyrian and Phoenician civilizations until discoveries began to be made a few years ago. And now they open anew, though not by far one of the earliest pages in the history of mankind. And yet how far back do those civilizations go in comparison with the oldest? And even then, history is slow to accept. Archaeology has sufficiently demonstrated that the memory of man runs back vastly further than history has been willing to accept, and the sacred records of once mighty nations, preserved by their heirs, are still more worthy of trust. We speak of civilizations of the anti-glacial period, and not only in the minds of the vulgar and the profane, but even in the opinion of the highly learned geologist, the claim sounds preposterous. What would you say then to our affirmation that the Chinese, I now speak of the inland, the true Chinaman, not of the hybrid mixture between the fourth and fifth races now occupying the throne, the Aborigines who belong in their unallied nationality wholly to the highest and last branch of the fourth race, reached their highest civilization when the fifth had hardly appeared in Asia. When was it? Calculate. The group of islands discovered by Nordenskjöld of the Vega was found strewn with fossils of horses, sheep, oxen, and sea, among gigantic bones of elephants, mammoths, rhinoceroses, and other monsters belonging to periods when man, says your science, had not yet made his appearance on Earth. How came horses and sheep to be found in company with the huge antediluvians? The region now locked in the fetters of eternal winter, uninhabited by man, that most fragile of animals, will very soon be proved to have had not only a tropical climate, something your science knows and does not dispute, but having been likewise the seat of one of the most ancient civilizations of the fourth race, whose highest relics we now find in the degenerate Chinaman, and whose lowest are hopelessly for the profane scientist intermixed with the remnants of the third. I told you before that the highest people now on Earth spiritually belong to the first subrace of the fifth root race, and those are the Aryan Asiatics. The highest race, physical intellectuality, is the last subrace of the fifth yourselves, the white conquerors. The majority of mankind belongs to the seventh subrace of the fourth root race, the above-mentioned Chinamen and their offshoots and branchlets, Malayans, Mongolians, Tibetans, Javanese, etc., etc., with remnants of other subraces of the fourth and the seventh subrace of the third race. All these fallen, degraded semblances of humanity are the direct lineal descendants of highly civilized nations, neither the names nor memory of which have survived, except in such books as Populva, the sacred book of the Guatemalans, and a few others unknown to science. I had inquired, was there any way of accounting for what seems the curious rush of human progress within the last 2,000 years, as compared with the relatively stagnant condition of the fourth round people up to the beginning of modern progress? This question it was that elicited the explanations quoted above, and also the following remarks in regard to the recent rush of human progress. The latter end of a very important cycle. Each round, each race, as every subrace, has its great and its smaller cycles on every planet that mankind passes through. Our fourth round humanity has its one great cycle, and so have its races and sub-races. The curious rush is due to the double effect of the former, the beginning of its downward course, and of the latter, the small cycle of your sub-race running on to its apex. Remember, you belong to the fifth race, yet you are but a Western sub-race. Notwithstanding your efforts, what you call civilization is confined only to the latter and its offshoots in America. Radiating around, its deceptive light may seem to throw its rays on a greater distance than it does in reality. There is no rush in China, and of Japan you make but a caricature. A student of occultism ought not to speak of the stagnant condition of the fourth round people, since history knows next to nothing of that condition, up to the beginning of modern progress, of other nations but the Western. What do you know of America, for instance? Before the invasion of that country by the Spaniards, less than 2 centuries prior to the arrival of Cortés, there was greater rush towards progress among the subraces of Peru and Mexico as there is now in Europe and the United States. Their subrace ended in nearly total annihilation through causes generated by itself. We may speak only of the stagnant condition into which, following the law of development, growth, maturity, and decline, every race and subrace falls during the transition periods. It is that latter condition your universal history is acquainted with. While it remains superbly ignorant of the condition even India was in some 10 centuries back. Your subraces are now running toward the apex of their respective cycles, and that history goes no further back than the periods of decline of a few other subraces, belonging most of them to the preceding fourth race. I had asked to what epoch Atlantis belonged, and whether the cataclysm by which it was destroyed came in an appointed place in the progress of evolution, corresponding for the development of races to the obscuration of planets. The answer was, To the Miocene times, everything comes in its appointed time and place in the evolution of rounds, otherwise it would be impossible for the best seer to calculate the exact hour and year when such cataclysms great and small have to occur. All an adept could do would be to predict an approximate time, whereas now events that result in great geological changes may be predicted with as mathematical a certainty as eclipses and other revolutions in space. The sinking of Atlantis, the group of continents and isles, began during the Miocene period, as certain of your continents are now observed to be gradually sinking, and it culminated first in the final disappearance of the largest continent, an event coincident with the elevation of the Alps, and second, with that of the last of the fair islands mentioned by Plato. The Egyptian priests of Sais told his ancestor, Solon, that Atlantis, that is the only remaining large island, had perished 9,000 years before their time. This was not a fancy date, since they had for millenniums preserved most carefully their records. But then, as I say, they spoke but of the Poseidonis, and would not reveal even to the great Greek legislator their secret chronology, as there are no geological reasons for doubting, but, on the contrary, a mass of evidence for accepting the tradition. Science has finally accepted the existence of the great continent and archipelago, and thus vindicated the truth of one more fable. The approach of every new obscuration is always signaled by cataclysms of either fire or water. But, apart from this, every root race has to be cut in two, so to say, by either one or the other. Thus, having reached the apex of its development and glory, the fourth race, the Atlanteans, were destroyed by water, you find now. But their degenerate fallen remnants, whose sub-races, nevertheless, each of them, has its palmy days of glory and relative greatness. What they are now, you will be someday, the law of cycles being one and immutable, when your race, the fifth, will have reached its zenith of physical intellectuality and developed its highest civilization. Remember the difference we make between material and spiritual civilizations, unable to go any higher in its own cycle. Its progress towards absolute evil will be arrested, as its predecessors, the Lemurians and the Atlanteans, the men of the third and fourth races, were arrested in their progress towards the same, by one of such cataclysmic changes, its great civilization destroyed, and all the sub-races of that race will be found going down their respective cycles after a short period of glory and learning. See the remnants of the Atlanteans, the old Greeks and Romans, the modern belong to the fifth race. See how great and how short, how evanescent were their days of fame and glory. For they were but sub-races of the 7 offshoots of the root race, branches of the subdivisions, according to the nomenclature I have adopted previously. No mother race, any more than her sub-races and offshoots, is allowed by the one reigning law to trespass upon the prerogatives of the race or sub-race that will follow it, least of all to encroach upon the knowledge and powers in store for its successor. The progress towards absolute evil, arrested by the cataclysms of each race in turn, sets in with the acquisition, by means of ordinary intellectual research and scientific advancement, of those powers over nature which accrue even now in adeptship from the premature development of higher faculties than those we ordinarily employ. I have spoken slightly of these powers in a preceding chapter, when endeavoring to describe our esoteric teachers. To describe them minutely would lead me into a long digression on occult phenomena. It is enough to say that they are such as cannot but be dangerous to society generally, and provocative of all manner of crimes which would utterly defy detection, if possessed by persons capable of regarding them as anything else but a profoundly sacred trust. Now some of these powers are simply the practical application of obscure forces of nature, susceptible of discovery in the course of ordinary scientific progress. Such progress had been accomplished by the Atlanteans. The worldly men of science in that race had learned the secrets of the disintegration and reintegration of matter, which few but practical spiritualists as yet know to be possible, and of control over the elementals, by means of which that and other even more portentous phenomena can be produced. Such powers in the hands of persons willing to use them for merely selfish and unscrupulous ends must not only be productive of social disaster, but also, for the persons who hold them, of progress in the direction of that evilly spiritual exaltation, which is a far more terrible result than suffering and inconvenience in this world. Thus it is, when physical intellect, unguarded by elevated morality, runs over into the proper region of spiritual advancement, that the natural law provides for its violent repression. The contingency will be better understood when we come to deal with the general destinies towards which humanity is tending. The principle under which the various races of man as they develop are controlled collectively by the cyclic law, however they may individually exercise the free will they unquestionably possess, is thus very plainly asserted. For people who have never regarded human affairs as covering more than the very short period with which history deals, the course of events will perhaps, as a rule, exhibit no cyclic character, but rather a checkered progress, hastened sometimes by great men and fortunate circumstances, sometimes retarded by war, bigotry, or intervals of intellectual sterility, but moving continually onwards in the long account, at one rate of speed or another. As the esoteric view of the matter, fortified by the wide range of observation which occult science is enabled to take, has an altogether opposite tendency, it seems worthwhile to conclude these explanations with an extract from a distinguished author, quite unconnected with the occult world, who nevertheless, from a close observation of the mere historical record, pronounces himself decisively in favor of the theory of cycles. In his History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, Dr. J. W. Draper writes as follows: "We are, as we often say, the creatures of circumstances. In that expression, there is a higher philosophy than might at first sight appear. From this more accurate point of view, we should therefore consider the course of these events, recognizing the principle that the affairs of men pass forward in a determinate way, expanding and unfolding themselves, and hence we see that the things of which we have spoken, as though they were matters of choice, were in reality force upon their apparent authors by the necessity of the times. But in truth they should be considered as the presentation of a certain phase of life which nations in their onward course sooner or later assume. To the individual, how well we know that a sober moderation of action, an appropriate gravity of demeanor, belong to the mature period of life, change from the wanton willfulness of youth, which may be ushered in, or its beginning marked by many accidental incidents, in one perhaps by domestic bereavements, in another by the loss of fortune, in a third by ill health. We are correct enough in imputing to such trials the change of character, but we never deceive ourselves by supposing that it would have failed to take place had those incidents not occurred. There runs an irresistible destiny in the midst of all these vicissitudes. There are analogies between the life of a nation and that of an individual who, though he may be in one respect the maker of his own fortunes, for happiness or for misery, for good or for evil, though he remains here or goes there, as his inclinations prompt, though he does this or abstains from that, as he chooses, is nevertheless held fast by an inexorable fate, a fate which brought him into the world involuntarily as far as he was concerned, which presses him forward through a definite career, the stages of which are absolutely invariable: infancy, childhood, youth, maturity, old age, with all their characteristic actions and passions, and which removes him from the scene at the appointed time, in most cases against his will. So also it is with nations, the voluntary is only the outward semblance, covering, but hardly hiding, the predetermined. Over the events of life we may have control, but none whatsoever over the law of its progress. There is a geometry that applies to nations an equation of their curve of advance, that no mortal man can touch." Chapter 5. Devachan. It was not possible to approach a consideration of the states into which the higher human principles pass at death, without first indicating the general framework of the whole design worked out in the course of the evolution of man. That much of my task, however, having now been accomplished, we may pass on to consider the natural destinies of each human ego in the interval which elapses between the close of one objective life and the commencement of another. At the commencement of another, the karma of the previous objective life determines the state of life into which the individual shall be born. This doctrine of karma is one of the most interesting features of Buddhist philosophy. There has been no secret about it at any time, though for want of a proper comprehension of elements in the philosophy which have been strictly esoteric, it may sometimes have been misunderstood. Karma is a collective expression applied to that complicated group of affinities for good and evil generated by a human being during life, and the character of which inheres in his fifth principle all through the interval which elapses between his death out of one objective life and his birth into the next. As stated sometimes, the doctrine seems to be one which exacts the notion of a superior spiritual authority summing up the acts of a man's life at its close, taking into consideration his good deeds and his bad, and giving judgment about him on the whole aspect of the case. But a comprehension of the way in which the human principles divide up at death will afford a clue to the comprehension of the way in which karma operates, and also of the great subject we may better take up first, the immediate spiritual condition of man after death. At death, the three lower principles, the body, its mere physical vitality, and its astral counterpart, are finally abandoned by that which really is the man himself, and the four higher principles escape into that world immediately above our own, that is, in the order of spirituality, not above it at all, but in it and of it, as regards real locality, the astral plane or Loca, according to a very familiar Sanskrit expression. Here a division takes place between the two duads, which the four higher principles include. The explanation already given concerning the imperfect extent to which the upper principles of man are as yet developed will show that this estimation of the process, as in the nature of a mechanical separation of the principles, is a rough way of dealing with the matter. It must be modified in the reader's mind by the light of what has been already said. It may be otherwise described as a trial of the extent to which the fifth principle has been developed, regarded in the light of the former idea. However, we must conceive the sixth and seventh principles, on the one hand, drawing the fifth, the human soul, in one direction, while the fourth draws it back earthwards in the other. Now, the fifth principle is a very complex entity, separable itself into superior and inferior elements. In the struggle which takes place between its late companion principles, its best, purest, most elevated and spiritual portions cling to. The sixth, its lower instincts, impulses and recollections adhere to the fourth, and it is in a measure torn asunder. The lower remnant, associating itself with the fourth, floats off in the Earth's atmosphere, while the best elements, those, be it understood, which really constitute the ego of the late earthly personality, the individuality, the consciousness thereof, follow the sixth and seventh into a spiritual condition, the nature of which we are about to examine. Rejecting the popular English name for this spiritual condition, as encrusted with too many misconceptions to be convenient, let us keep to the Oriental designation of that region or state into which the higher principles of human creatures pass at death. This is additionally desirable because, although the Devachan of Buddhist philosophy corresponds in some respects to the modern European idea of heaven, it differs from heaven in others which are even more important. Firstly, however, in Devachan, that which survives is not merely the individual monad, which survives through all the changes of the whole evolutionary scheme, and flits from body to body, from planet to planet and so forth. That which survives in Devachan is the man's own self-conscious personality, under some restrictions indeed which we will come to directly, but still it is the same personality as regards its higher feelings, aspirations, affections, and even tastes, as it was on Earth. Perhaps it would be better to say the essence of the late self-conscious personality. It may be worth the reader's while to learn what Colonel H.S. Olcott has to say in his Buddhist Catechism 14,000 of the intrinsic difference between individuality and personality, since he wrote not only under the approval of the high priest of the Shripada and Gale, Sumangala, but also under the direct instruction of his adept guru. His words will have weight for the student of occultism. This is what he says in his appendix. Upon reflection, I have submitted personality for individuality, as written in the first edition. The successive appearances upon one or many earths, or descents into generation of the tanhakely coherent part skandhas of a certain being, are a succession of personalities. In each birth, the personality differs from that of the previous or next succeeding birth. Karma, the deus ex machina, masks, or shall we say, reflects, itself now in the personality of a sage, again as an artisan, and so on throughout the string of births. But though personalities ever shift, the one line of life along which they are strung like beads runs unbroken. It is ever that particular line, never any other. It is therefore individual, an individual vital undulation which began in nirvana, or the subjective side of nature, as the light or heat undulation through jnana began at its dynamic source, is careering through the objective side of nature, under the impulse of karma and the creative direction of tanha, and tends through many cyclic changes back to nirvana. Mr. Rhys Davids calls that which passes from personality to personality along the individual chain character or doing. But since character is not a mere metaphysical abstraction, but the sum of one's mental qualities and moral propensities, would it not help to dispel what Mr. Rhys Davids calls the desperate expedient of a mystery, if we regarded the life undulation as individuality, and each of its series of natal manifestations as a separate personality? The denial of soul by Buddha, see Sanyutta Nikaya, the Sutta Pitaka, points to the prevalent delusive belief in an independent transmissible personality, and entity that could move from birth to birth unchanged, or go to a place or state where, as such perfect entity, it could eternally enjoy or suffer. And what he shows is that the I am I consciousness is, as regards permanency, logically impossible, since its elementary constituents constantly change, and the I of one birth differs from the I of every other birth. But everything that I have found in Buddhism accords with the theory of a gradual evolution of the perfect man, viz., a Buddha through numberless natal experiences, and in the consciousness of that person who at the end of a given chain of beings attains Buddhahood, or who succeeds in attaining the fourth stage of dhyana, or mystic self, development, in any one of his births anterior to the final one, the scenes of all these serial births are perceptible. In the Jatakata Havanana, so well translated by Mr. Rhys-Davids, an expression continually recurs which I think rather supports such an idea, viz., then the Blessed One made manifest an occurrence hidden by change of birth, or that which had been hidden by Angsi. Early Buddhism, then, clearly held to a permanency of records in the Akasa, and the potential capacity of man to read the same when he has evoluted to the stage of true individual enlightenment. The purely sensual feelings and tastes of the late personality will drop off from it in Devachan, but it does not follow that nothing is preservable in that state, except feelings and thoughts, having a direct reference to religion or spiritual philosophy. On the contrary, all the superior phases, even of sensuous emotion, find their appropriate sphere of development in Devachan. To suggest a whole range of ideas by means of one illustration, a soul in Devachan, if the soul of a man who was passionately devoted to music, would be continuously enraptured by the sensations music produces. The person whose happiness of the higher sort on earth had been entirely centered in the exercise of the affections will miss none in Devachan of those whom he or she loved. But, at once it will be asked, if some of these are not themselves fit for Devachan, how then? The answer is, that does not matter. For the person who loved them, they will be there. It is not necessary to say much more to give a clue to the position. Devachan is a subjective state. It will seem as real as the chairs and tables round us. And remember that, above all things, to the profound philosophy of occultism, are the chairs and tables, and the whole objective scenery of the world, unreal and merely transitory delusions of sense. As real as the realities of this world to us, and even more so, will be the realities of Devachan to those who go into that state. From this it ensues that the subjective isolation of Devachan, as it will perhaps be conceived at first, is not real isolation at all. As the word is understood on the physical plane of existence, it is companionship with all that the true soul craves for, whether persons, things, or knowledge. And a patient consideration of the place in nature which Devachan occupies will show that this subjective isolation of each human unit is the only condition which renders possible anything which can be described as a felicitous spiritual existence after death for mankind at large, and Devachan is as much a purely and absolutely felicitous condition for all who attain it, as Avicii is the reverse of it. There is no inequality or injustice in the system. Devachan is by no means the same thing for the good and the indifferent alike. But it is not a life of responsibility, and therefore there is no logical place for it for suffering, any more than in Avicii there is any room for enjoyment or repentance. It is a life of effects, not of causes, a life of being. Paid your earnings, not of laboring for them. Therefore it is impossible to be during that life cognizant of what is going on earth. Under the operation of such cognition, there would be no true happiness possible in the state after death. A heaven which constituted a watchtower, from which the occupants could still survey the miseries of the earth, would really be a place of acute mental suffering for its most sympathetic, unselfish, and meritorious inhabitants. If we invest them in imagination with such a very limited range of sympathy, that they could be imagined as not caring about the spectacle of suffering after the few persons to whom they were immediately attached had died and joined them, still they would have a very unhappy period of waiting to go through before survivors reach the end of an often long and toilsome existence below. And even this hypothesis would be further vitiated by making heaven most painful for occupants who were most unselfish and sympathetic, whose reflected distress would thus continue on behalf of the afflicted race of mankind generally, even after their personal kindred had been rescued by the lapse of time. The only escape from this dilemma lies in the supposition that heaven is not yet opened for business, so to speak, and that all people, who have ever lived from Adam downwards, are still lying in a death-like trance, waiting for the resurrection at the end of the world. This hypothesis also has its embarrassments, but we are concerned at present with the scientific harmony of esoteric Buddhism, not with the theories of other creeds. Readers, however, who may grant that a purview of earthly life from heaven would render happiness in heaven impossible, may still doubt whether true happiness is possible in the state, as it may be objected, of monotonous isolation now described. The objection is merely raised from the point of view of an imagination that cannot escape from its present surroundings. To begin with, about monotony. No one will complain of having experienced monotony during the minute or moment or half hour, as it may have been of the greatest happiness he may have enjoyed in life. Most people have had some happy moments, at all events, to look back to for the purpose of this comparison, and let us take even one such minute or moment, too short to be open to the least suspicion of monotony, and imagine its sensations immensely prolonged without any external events in progress to mark the lapse of time. There is no room in such a condition of things for the conception of weariness. The unalloyed, unchangeable sensation of intense happiness goes on, not forever, because the causes which have produced it are not infinite themselves, but for very long periods of time, until the efficient impulse has exhausted itself. Nor must it be supposed that there is, so to speak, no change of occupation for souls in Devachan, that any one moment of earthly sensation is selected for exclusive perpetuation. As a teacher of the highest authority on this subject writes, there are two fields of causal manifestations, the objective and subjective. The grosser energies, those which operate in the denser condition of matter, manifest objectively in the next physical life, their outcome being the new personality of each birth marshalling within the grand cycle of the evolving individuality. It is but the moral and spiritual activities that find their sphere of effects in Devachan, and, thought and fancy being limitless, how can it be argued for one moment that there is anything like monotony in the state of Devachan? Few are the men whose lives were so utterly destitute of feeling, love, or of a more or less intense predilection for some one line of thought, as to be made unfit for a proportionate period of devachanic experience beyond their earthly life. So, for instance, while the vices, physical and sensual attractions, say, of a great philosopher, but a bad friend and a selfish man, may result in the birth of a new and still greater intellect, but at the same time, a most miserable man, reaping the karmic effects of all the causes produced by the old being, and whose make-up was inevitable from the preponderating proclivities of that being in the preceding birth. The intermedial period between the two physical births cannot be, in nature's exquisitely well-adjusted laws, but a hiatus of unconsciousness. There can be no such dreary blank as kindly promised, or rather implied by Christian Protestant theology, to the departed souls, which between death and resurrection have to hang on in space, in mental catalepsy, awaiting the day of judgment. Causes produced by mental and spiritual energy being far greater, and more important than those that are created by physical impulses, their effects have to be, for weal or woe, proportionately as great, lives on this earth or other earths, affording no proper field for such effects, and every laborer being entitled to his own harvest, they have to expand in either Devachan or Avicii. The lowest states of Devachan interchain with those of Avicii. Bacon, for instance, whom a poet called the brightest, wisest, meanest of mankind, might reappear in his next incarnation as a greedy money-getter with extraordinary intellectual capacities. But, however great the latter, they would find no proper field in which that particular line of thought, pursued during his previous lifetime by the founder of modern philosophy, could reap all its dues. It would be but the astute lawyer, the corrupt attorney general, the ungrateful friend, and the dishonest Lord Chancellor, who might find, led on by his karma, a congenial new soil in the body of the moneylender, and reappear as a new Shylock. But where would Bacon, the incomparable thinker, with whom philosophical inquiry upon the most profound problems of nature was his first and last and only love, where would this intellectual giant of his race, once disrobed of his lower nature, go to? Have all the effects of that magnificent intellect to vanish and disappear? Certainly not. Thus his moral and spiritual qualities would also have to find a field in which their energies could expand themselves. Devachan is such a field. Hence all the great plans of moral reform, of intellectual research into abstract principles of nature, all the divine spiritual aspirations that had so filled the brightest part of his life would in Devachan come to fruition, and the abstract entity, known in the preceding birth as Francis Bacon, and that may be known in its subsequent reincarnation as a despised usurer, that Bacon's own creation, his Frankenstein, the son of his karma, shall, in the meanwhile, occupy itself in this inner world, also of its own preparation, in enjoying the effects of the grand beneficial spiritual causes sown in life. It would live a purely and spiritually conscious existence, a dream of realistic vividness, until karma, being satisfied in that direction and the ripple of force reaching the edge of its sub-cycle basin, the being should move into its next area of causes, either in this same world or another, according to his stage of progression. Therefore, there is a change of occupation, a continual change in Devachan. For that dream life is but the fruition, the harvest time, of those psychic seed germs dropped from the tree of physical existence in our moments of dream, and hope fancy glimpses of bliss and happiness, stifled in an ungrateful social soil, blooming in the rosy dawn of Devachan, and ripening under its ever-fructifying sky. If man had but one single moment of ideal experience, not even then could it be, as erroneously supposed, the indefinite prolongation of that single moment. That one note, struck from the lyre of life, would form the keynote of the being's subjective state and work out into numberless harmonic tones and semitones of psychic phantasmagoria. There, all unrealized hopes, aspirations, dreams become fully realized, and the dreams of the objective become the realities of the subjective existence. And there, behind the curtain of Maya, its vaporous and deceptive appearances are perceived by the initiate, who has learned the great secret how to penetrate thus deep into the arcana of being. As physical existence has its cumulative intensity from infancy to prime, and its diminishing energy thenceforward to dotage and death, so the dream life of Devachan is lived correspondentially. There is the first flutter of psychic life, the attainment of prime, the gradual exhaustion of force passing into conscious lethargy, semi-unconsciousness, oblivion, and not death, but birth into another personality, and the resumption of action which daily begets new congeries of causes that must be worked out in another term of Devachan. It is not a reality then, it is a mere dream, objectors will urge, the soul so bathed in a delusive sensation of enjoyment, which has no reality all the while, is being cheated by nature, and must encounter a terrible shock when it wakes to its mistake. But, in the nature of things, it never does or can wake. The waking from Devachan is its next birth into objective life, and the draught of Lethe has then been taken. Nor as regards the isolation of each soul is there any consciousness of isolation whatever, nor is there ever possibly a parting from its chosen associates. Those associates are not in the nature of companions who may wish to go away, of friends who may tire of the friend that loves them, even if he or she does not tire of them. Love, the creating force, has placed their living image before the personal soul which craves for their presence, and that image will never fly away. On this aspect of the subject, I may again avail myself of the language of my teacher. Objectors of that kind will be simply postulating an incongruity, an intercourse of entities in Devachan, which applies only to the mutual relationship of physical existence. Two sympathetic souls, both disembodied, will each work out its own Devachanic sensations, making the other a sharer in its subjective bliss. This will be as real to them, naturally, as though both were yet on this earth. Nevertheless, each is dissociated from the other, as regards personal or corporeal association, while the latter is the only one of its kind that is recognized by our earth experience as an actual intercourse. For the Devachani it would be not only something unreal, but could have no existence for it in any sense, not even as a delusion, a physical body, or even a Mayavi Rupa remaining to its spiritual senses as invisible as it is itself to the physical senses of those who loved it best on earth. Thus, even though one of the sharers were alive and utterly unconscious of that intercourse in his waking state, still every dealing with him would be to the Devachani an absolute reality, and what actual companionship could there ever be other than the purely idealistic one, as above described, between two subjective entities which are not even as material as that ethereal body shadow, the Mayavi Rupa? To object to this on the ground that one is thus cheated by nature, and to call it a delusive sensation of enjoyment which has no reality, is to show oneself utterly unfit to comprehend the conditions of life, and being outside of our material existence. For how can the same distinction be made in Devachan, that is outside of the conditions of earth life, between what we call a reality and a factitious or an artificial counterfeit of the same in this, our world? The same principle cannot apply to the two sets of conditions. It is conceivable that what we call a reality in our embodied physical state will exist under the same conditions as an actuality for a disembodied entity. On earth, man is dual, in the sense of being a thing of matter and a thing of spirit, hence the natural distinction made by his mind, the analyst of his physical sensations and spiritual perceptions, between an actuality and a fiction, though, even in this life, the two groups of faculties are constantly equilibrating each other, each group, when dominant, seeing as fiction or delusion what the other believes to be most real. But in Devachan, our ego has ceased to be dualistic in the above sense, and becomes a spiritual mental entity. That which was a fiction, a dream in life, and which had its being but in the region of fancy, becomes under the new conditions of existence the only possible reality. Thus, for us to postulate the possibility of any other reality for a Devachani is to maintain an absurdity, a monstrous fallacy, an idea unphilosophical. To the last degree, the actual is that which is acted or performed de facto. The reality of a thing is proved by its actuality, and the suppositions and artificial having no possible existence in that Devachanic state, The logical sequence is that everything in it is actual and real. For again, whether overshadowing the 5 principles during the life of the personality, or entirely separated from the grosser principles by the dissolution of the body, the 6th principle, or our spiritual soul, has no substance. It is ever arupa, nor is it confined to one place with a limited horizon of perceptions around it. Therefore, whether in or out of its mortal body, it is ever distinct and free from its limitations, and if we call its devachanic experiences a cheating of nature, then we should never be allowed to call reality any of those purely abstract feelings that belong entirely to, and are reflected and assimilated by, our higher soul. Such, for instance, as an ideal perception of the beautiful, profound philanthropy, love, eon-si, as well as every other purely spiritual sensation that during life fills our inner being with either immense joy or pain. We must remember that by the very nature of the system described, there are infinite varieties of well-being in Devachan, suited to the infinite varieties of merit in mankind. If the next world really were the objective heaven which ordinary theology preaches, there would be endless injustice and inaccuracy in its operation. People, to begin with, would be either admitted or excluded, and the differences of favor shown to different guests within the all-favored region would not sufficiently provide for differences of merit in this life. But the real heaven of our earth adjusts itself to the needs and merits of each new arrival with unfailing certainty, not merely as regards the duration of the blissful state, which is determined by the causes engendered during objective life, but as regards the intensity and amplitude of the emotions which constitute that blissful state. The heaven of each person who attains the really existent heaven is precisely fitted to his capacity for enjoying it. It is the creation of his own aspirations and faculties. More than this, it may be impossible for the uninitiated comprehension to realize. But this indication of its character is enough to show how perfectly it falls into its appointed place in the whole scheme of evolution. Devachan, to resume my direct quotations, is of course a state, not a locality, as much as Avicii, its antithesis which please not to confound with hell. Esoteric Buddhist philosophy has 3 principal lokas so-called, namely, 1. Kama Loka, 2. Rupa Loka, and 3. Arupa Loka, or in their literal translation and meaning, 1. World of desires or passions, of unsatisfied earthly cravings, the abode of shells and victims, of elementaries and suicides. 2. The world of forms, i.e. of shadows more spiritual, having form and objectivity, but no substance. And 3. The formless world, or rather the world of no form, the incorporeal, since its denizens can have neither body, shape, nor color for us mortals, and in the sense that we give to these terms. These are the 3 spheres of ascending spirituality in which the several groups of subjective and semi-subjective entities find their attractions. All but the suicides and the victims of premature violent deaths go, according to their attractions and powers, either into the Devachanic or the Avicii state, which 2 states form the numberless subdivisions of Rupa and Arupa Locus. That is to say that such states not only vary in degree or in their presentation to the subject entity as regards form, color, and see, but that there is an infinite scale of such states in their progressive spirituality and intensity of feeling, from the lowest in the Rupa up to the highest and the most exalted in the Arupa Loka. The student must bear in mind that personality is the synonym for limitation, and that the more selfish, the more contracted the person's ideas, the closer will he cling to the lower spheres of being, the longer loiter on the plane of selfish social intercourse. Devachan being a condition of mere subjective enjoyment, the duration and intensity of which is determined by the merit and spirituality of the earth life last past, there is no opportunity, while the soul inhabits it, for the punctual requital of evil deeds. But nature does not content herself with either forgiving sins in a free and easy way, or damning sinners outright, like a lazy master too indolent, rather than too good-natured, to govern his household justly. The karma of evil, be it great or small, is as certainly operative at the appointed time as the karma of good. But the place of its operation is not Devachan, but either a new rebirth or Avicii, a state to be reached only in exceptional cases and by exceptional natures. In other words, while the commonplace sinner will reap the fruits of his evil deeds in a following reincarnation, the exceptional criminal, the aristocrat of sin, has Avicii in prospect. That is to say, the condition of subjective spiritual misery, which is the reverse side of Devachan. Avicii is a state of the most ideal spiritual wickedness, something akin to the state of Lucifer, so superbly described by Milton. Not many, though, are there who can reach it, as the thoughtful reader will perceive. And if it is urged that since there is Devachan for nearly all, for the good, the bad, and the indifferent, the ends of harmony and equilibrium are frustrated, and the law of retribution and of impartial implacable justice, hardly met and satisfied by such a comparative scarcity, if not absence of its antithesis, then the answer will show that it is not so. Evil is the dark son of earth matter, and good the fair daughter of heaven, or spirit, says the Chinese philosopher. Hence the place of punishment for most of our sins is the earth, its birthplace and playground. There is more apparent and relative than actual evil even on earth, and it is not given to the hoi polloi to reach the fatal grandeur and eminence of a Satan every day. Generally, the rebirth into objective existence is the event for which the karma of evil patiently waits, and then it irresistibly asserts itself. Not that the karma of good exhausts itself in Devachan, leaving the unhappy monad to develop a new consciousness with no material beyond the evil deeds of its last personality. The rebirth will be qualified by the merit as well as the demerit of the previous life, but the Devachan existence is a rosy sleep, a peaceful night, with dreams more vivid than day, and imperishable for many centuries. It will be seen that the Devachan state is only one of the conditions of existence which go to make up the whole spiritual or relatively spiritual complement of our earth life. Observers of spiritualistic phenomena would never have been perplexed, as they have been, if there were no other but the Devachan state to be dealt with. For once in Devachan there is very little opportunity for communication between a spirit, then wholly absorbed in its own sensations and practically oblivious of the earth left behind, and its former friends still living. Whether gone before or yet remaining on earth, those friends, if the bond of affection has been sufficiently strong, will be with the happy spirit still to all intents and purposes for him, and as happy, blissful, innocent, as the disembodied dreamer himself. It is possible, however, for yet living persons to have visions of Devachan, though such visions are rare, and only one-sided, the entities in Devachan, sighted by the earthly clairvoyant, being quite unconscious themselves of undergoing such observation. The spirit of the clairvoyant ascends into the condition of Devachan in such rare visions, and thus becomes subject to the vivid delusions of that existence. It is under the impression that the spirits, with which it is in Devachanic bonds of sympathy, have come down to visit Earth and itself, while the converse operation has really taken place. The clairvoyant spirit has been raised towards those in Devachan. Thus many of the subjective spiritual communications, most of them when the sensitives are pure-minded, are real, though it is most difficult for the uninitiated medium to fix in his mind the true and correct pictures of what he sees and hears. In the same way, some of the phenomena called psychography, though more rarely, are also real. The spirit of the sensitive, getting odalized, so to say, by the aura of the spirit in the Devachan, becomes for a few minutes that departed personality and writes in the handwriting of the latter, in his language and in his thoughts, as they were during his lifetime. The two spirits become blended in one, and the preponderance of one over the other during such phenomena determines the preponderance of personality in the characteristic exhibited. Thus it may incidentally be observed, what is called rapport is, in plain fact, an identity of molecular vibration between the astral part of the incarnate medium and the astral part of the disincarnate personality. As already indicated, and as the common sense of the mater would show, there are great varieties of states in Devachan, and each personality drops into its befitting place there. Thence, consequently, he emerges in his befitting place in the world of causes, this earth or another, as the case may be, when his time for rebirth comes. Coupled with survival of the affinities, comprehensively described as karma, the affinities both for good and evil engendered by the previous life, this process will be seen to accomplish nothing less than an explanation of the problem, which has always been regarded as so incomprehensible, the inequalities of life. The conditions on which we enter life are the consequences of the use we have made of our last set of conditions. They do not impede the development of fresh karma, whatever they may be, for this will be generated by the use we make of them in turn. Nor is it to be supposed that every event of a current life which bestows joy or sorrow is old karma bearing fruit. Many may be the immediate consequences of acts in the life to which they belong, ready money transactions with nature, so to speak, of which it may be hardly necessary to make any entry in her books. But the great inequalities of life, as regards the start in it which different human beings make, is a manifest consequence of old karma, the infinite varieties of which always keep up a constant supply of recruits for all the manifold varieties of human condition. It must not be supposed that the real ego slips instantaneously at death from the earth life and its entanglements into the devachanic condition. When the division of, or purification of the fifth principle has been accomplished in karma Loca by the contending attractions of the fourth and sixth principles, the real ego passes into a period of unconscious gestation. I have spoken already of the way in which the Devachanic life is in itself a process of growth, maturity, and decline, but the analogies of Earth are even more closely preserved. There is a spiritual antenatal state at the entrance to spiritual life, as there is a similar and equally unconscious physical state at the entrance to objective life. And this period, in different cases, may be of very different duration, from a few moments to immense periods of years. When a man dies, his soul or fifth principle becomes unconscious and loses all remembrance of things internal as well as external. Whether his stay in Kama Loka has to last but a few moments, hours, days, weeks, months, or years, whether he dies a natural or a violent death, whether this occurs in youth or age, and whether the ego has been good, bad, or indifferent, his consciousness leaves him as suddenly as the flame leaves a wick when it is blown out. When life has retired from the last particle of the brain matter, his perceptive faculties become extinct forever, and his spiritual powers of cognition and volition become for the time being as extinct as the others. His Mayavi Rupa may be thrown into objectivity, as in the case of apparitions after death, but unless it is projected by a conscious or intense desire to see or appear to someone shooting through the dying brain, the apparition will be simply automatic. The revival of consciousness in Kama Loka is obviously, from what has been said, a phenomenon that depends on the characteristic of the principles passing, unconsciously at the moment, out of the dying body. It may become tolerably complete under circumstances by no means to be desired, or it may be obliterated by a rapid passage into the gestation state leading to Devachan. This gestation state may be of very long duration in proportion to the ego's spiritual stamina, and Devachan accounts for the remainder of the period between death and the next physical or rebirth. The whole period is, of course, of very varying length in the case of different persons, but rebirth in less than 1500 years is spoken of as almost impossible, while the stay in Devachan, which rewards a very rich karma, is sometimes said to extend to enormous periods. Annotations. The comments I have to make on the doctrine embodied in the foregoing chapter will be postponed most conveniently to the end of the next, and offered in connection with those applying to the conditions of Kama Loka. Chapter 6. Kama Loka. The statements already made in reference to the destiny of the higher human principles at death will pave the way for a comprehension of the circumstances in which the inferior remnant of these principles finds itself after the real ego has passed either into the Devachanic state or that unconscious intervening period of preparation, therefore, which corresponds to physical gestation. The sphere in which such remnants remain for a time is known to occult science as Kama Loka, the region of desire. Not the region in which desire is developed to any abnormal degree of intensity as compared with desire as it attaches to earth life, but the sphere in which that sensation of desire, which is a part of the earth life, is capable of surviving. It will be obvious from what has been said about Devachan that a large part of the recollections which accumulate round the human ego during life are incompatible in their nature with the pure subjective existence to which the real, durable spiritual ego passes, but they are not necessarily on that account extinguished or annihilated out of existence. They inhere in certain molecules of those finer, but not finest principles, which escape from the body at death, and just as dissolution separates what is loosely called the soul from the body, so also it provokes a further separation between the constituent elements of the soul. So much of the fifth principle, or human soul, which is in its nature assimilable with, or has gravitated upward towards, the sixth principle, the spiritual soul, passes with the germ of that divine soul into the superior region, or state of Devachan, in which it separates itself almost completely from the attractions of the earth, quite completely, as far as its own spiritual course is concerned, though it still has certain affinities with the spiritual aspirations emanating from the earth, and may sometimes draw these towards itself. But the animal soul, or fourth principle, the element of will and desire, as associated with objective existence, has no upward attraction, and no more passes away from the earth than the particles of the body consigned to the grave. It is not in the grave, however, that this fourth principle can be put away. It is not spiritual in its nature or affinities, but it is not physical in its nature. In its affinities it is physical, and hence the result. It remains within the actual physical local attraction of the earth, in the earth's atmosphere, or since it is not the gases of the atmosphere that are specially to be considered in connection with the problem in hand, let us say, in Kama Loka. And with the fourth principle, a large part, as regards most of mankind unfortunately, though a part very variable in its relative magnitude, inevitably remains. There are plenty of attributes which the ordinary composite human being exhibits many ardent feelings, desires, and acts, floods of recollections, which, even if not concerned with a life, as ardent perhaps as those which have to do with the higher aspirations, are nevertheless essentially belonging to the physical life, which take time to die. They remain behind in association with the fourth principle, which is altogether of the earthly perishable nature, and disperse or fade out, or are absorbed into the respective universal principles, to which they belong just as the body is absorbed into the earth, in progress of time, and rapidly or slowly, in proportion to the tenacity of their substance. And where meanwhile is the consciousness of the individual who has died or dissolved? Assuredly in Devachan, but a difficulty presents itself to the mind untrained in occult science, from the fact that a semblance of consciousness inheres in the astral portion, the fourth principle, with a portion of the fifth, which remains behind in Loca. The individual consciousness, it is argued, cannot be in two places at once, but first of all, to a certain extent, it can. As may be perceived presently, it is a mistake to speak of consciousness as we understand the feeling of life attaching to the astral shell or remnant, but nevertheless, a certain spurious manifestation of consciousness may be reawakened in the shell, without having any connection with the real consciousness, all the while growing in strength and vitality in the spiritual sphere. There is no power on the part of the shell of taking in and assimilating new ideas and initiating courses of action on the basis of those new ideas. But there is in the shell a survival of volitional impulses imparted to it during life. The fourth principle is the instrument of volition, though not volition itself, and impulses imparted to it during life by the higher principles may run their course and produce results almost indistinguishable for careless observers from those which would ensue were the four higher principles really all united, as in life. The fourth principle is the vehicle during life of that essentially mortal consciousness which cannot suit itself to conditions of permanent existence, but the consciousness even of the lower principles during life is a very different thing from the vaporous, fleeting, and uncertain consciousness which continues to inhere in them when that which really is the life, the overshadowing of them, or their vitalization by the infusion of the spirit, has ceased as far as they are concerned. Language cannot render all the facets of a many-sided idea intelligible at once, any more than a plain drawing can show all sides of a solid object. And at the first glance, different drawings of the same object from different points of view may seem so unlike as to be unrecognizable as the same, but nonetheless, by the time they are put together in the mind, will their diversities be seen to harmonize. So with these subtle attributes of the invisible principles of man, no treatise can do more than discuss their different aspects separately. The various views suggested must mingle in the reader's mind before the complete conception corresponds to the realities of nature. In life, the fourth principle is the seat of will and desire, but it is not will itself. It must be alive, in union with the overshadowing spirit, or one life, to be thus the agent of that very elevated function of life, will in its sublime potency. As already mentioned, the Sanskrit names of the higher principles connote the idea that they are vehicles of the one life. Not that the one life is a separable molecular principle itself, it is the union of all, the influence of the spirit. But in truth, the idea is too subtle for language, perhaps for intellect itself. Its manifestation in the present case, however, is apparent enough. Whatever the willing fourth principle may be when alive, it is no longer capable of active will when dead. But then, under certain abnormal conditions, it may partially recover life for a time, and this fact it is which explains many, though by no means all, of the phenomena of spiritualistic mediumship. The elementary, be it remembered, as the astral shell has generally been called in former occult writings, is liable to be galvanized, for a time in the mediumistic current into a state of consciousness and life, which may be suggested by the first condition of a person who, carried into a strange room in a state of insensibility during illness, wakes up feeble, confused in mind, gazing about with a blank feeling of bewilderment, taking in impressions, hearing words addressed to him, and answering vaguely. Such a state of consciousness is unassociated with the notions of past or future. It is an automatic consciousness derived from the medium. A medium, be it remembered, is a person whose principles are loosely united and susceptible of being borrowed by other beings, or by floating principles having an attraction for some of them or some part of them. Now, what happens in the case of a shell drawn into the neighborhood of a person so constituted? Suppose the person from whom the shell has been cast died with some strong unsatisfied desire, not necessarily of an unholy sort, but connected entirely with the earth life, a desire, for example, to communicate some fact to a still living person. Certainly the shell does not go about in Kama Loca with a persistent, intelligent, conscious purpose of communicating that fact, but, amongst others, the volitional impulse to do this has been infused into the fourth principle. And while the molecules of that principle remain in association, and that may be for many years, they only need a partial galvanization into life again to become operative in the direction of the original impulse. Such a shell comes into contact with a medium not so dissimilar in nature from the person who had died as to render a rapport impossible, and something from the fifth principle of the medium associates itself with the wandering fourth principle, and sets the original impulse to work. So much consciousness and so much intelligence as may be required to guide the fourth principle in the use of the immediate means of communication at hand, a slate and pencil or a table to rap upon, is borrowed from the medium, and then the message given may be the message which the dead person originally ordered his fourth principle to give, so to speak, but which the shell has never till then had an opportunity of giving. It may be argued that the production of writing on a closed slate, or of raps on a table, without the use of a knuckle or a stick, is itself a feat of a marvelous nature, bespeaking a knowledge on the part of the communicating intelligence of powers in nature we in physical life know nothing about. But the shell is itself in the astral world, in the realm of such powers. A phenomenal manifestation is its natural mode of dealing. It is no more conscious of producing a wonderful result by the use of new powers acquired in a higher sphere of existence than we are conscious of the forces by which in life the volitional impulse is communicable to nerves and muscles. But, it may be objected, the communicating intelligence at a spiritual séance will constantly perform remarkable feats for no other than their own sake, to exhibit the power over natural forces which it possesses. The reader will please remember, however, that occult science is very far from saying that all the phenomena of spiritualism are traceable to one class of agents. Hitherto in this treatise little has been said of the elementals, those semi-intelligent creatures of the astral light, who belong to a wholly different kingdom of nature from ourselves. Nor is it possible at present to enlarge upon their attributes, for the simple and obvious reason that knowledge concerning the elementals, detailed knowledge on that subject, and in regard to the way they work, is scrupulously withheld by the adepts of occultism. To possess such knowledge is to wield power, and the whole motive of the great secrecy in which occult science is shrouded turns upon the danger of conferring powers upon people who have not, first of all, by undergoing the training of initiates, given moral guarantees of their trustworthiness. It is by command over the elementals that some of the greatest physical feats of adeptship are accomplished, and it is by the spontaneous, playful acts of the elementals that the greatest physical phenomena of the séance room are brought about. So also with almost all Indian fakirs and yogis of the lower class who have power of producing phenomenal results. By some means, by a scrap of inherited occult teaching, most likely, they have come into possession of a morsel of occult science. They may not necessarily understand the action of the forces they employ, any more than an Indian servant in a telegraph office, taught how to mix the ingredients of the liquid used in a galvanic battery, understands the theory of electric science. He can perform the one trick he has been taught, and so with the inferior yogi. He has got influence over certain elementals, and can work certain wonders. Returning to a consideration of the ex-human shells in Kama Loca, it may be argued that their behavior in spiritual answers is not covered by the theory that they have had some message to deliver from their late master, and have availed themselves of the mediumship present to deliver it. Apart altogether from phenomena that may be put aside as elemental pranks, we sometimes encounter a continuity of intelligence on the part of the elementary or shell that bespeaks much more than the survival of impulses from the former life. Quite so, but with portions of the medium's fifth principle conveyed into it, the fourth principle is once more an instrument in the hands of a master. With a medium entranced so that the energies of the fifth principle are conveyed into the wandering shell to a very large extent, the result is that there is a very tolerable revival of consciousness in the shell for the time being, as regards the given moment. But what is the nature of such consciousness after all? Nothing more, really, than a reflected light. Memory is one thing, and perceptive faculties quite another. A madman may remember very clearly some portions of his past life, yet he is unable to perceive anything in its true light, for the higher portion of his manas, fifth, and buddhi, sixth principles are paralyzed in him and have left him. Could an animal, a dog for instance, explain himself, he could prove that his memory, in direct relation to his canine personality, is as fresh as his master's. Nevertheless, his memory and instinct cannot be called perceptive faculties. Once that a shell is in the aura of a medium, he will perceive, clearly enough, whatever he can perceive through the borrowed principles of the medium, and through organs in magnetic sympathy therewith, But this will not carry him beyond the range of the perceptive faculties of the medium or of someone else present in the circle. Hence the often rational and sometimes highly intelligent answers he may give, and hence, also, his invariably complete oblivion of all things unknown to that medium or circle, or not found in the lower recollections of his late personality, galvanized afresh by the influences under which he is placed. The shell of a highly intelligent, learned, but utterly unspiritual man who died a natural death will last longer than those of weaker temperament, and, the shadow of his own memory helping, he may deliver, through trance speakers, orations of no contemptible kind. But these will never be found to relate to anything beyond the subjects he thought much and earnestly of during life, nor will any word ever fall from him indicating a real advance of knowledge. It will easily be seen that a shell, drawn into the mediumistic current, and getting into rapport with the medium's fifth principle, is not by any means sure to be animated with a consciousness, even for what such consciousness are worth, identical with the personality of the dead person from whose higher principles it was shed. It is just as likely to reflect some quite different personality, caught from the suggestions of the medium's mind. In this personality it will perhaps remain and answer for a time, then some new current of thought thrown into the minds of the people present will find its echo in the fleeting impressions of the elementary, and his sense of identity will begin to waver. For a little while, it flickers over 2 or 3 conjectures, and ends by going out altogether for a time. The shell is once more sleeping in the astral light, and may be unconsciously wafted in a few moments to the other ends of the earth. Besides the ordinary elementary or shell of the kind just described, Kama Loca is the abode of another class of astral entities, which must be taken into account if we desire to comprehend the various conditions under which human creatures may pass from this life to others. So far we have been examining the normal course of events, when people die in a natural manner, but an abnormal death will lead to abnormal consequences. Thus in the case of persons committing suicide, and in that of persons killed by sudden accident, results ensue which differ widely from those following natural deaths. A thoughtful consideration of such cases must show, indeed, that in a world governed by rule and law, by affinities working out their regular effects in that deliberate way which nature favors, the case of a person dying a sudden death at a time when all his principles are firmly united and ready to hold together for 20, 40, or 60 years, whatever the natural remainder of his life would be, must surely be something different from that of a person who, by natural processes of decay, finds himself, when the vital machine stops, readily separable into his various principles, each prepared to travel their separate ways. Nature, always fertile in analogies, at once illustrates the idea by showing us a ripe and an unripe fruit. From out of the first, the inner stone will come away as cleanly and easily as a hand from a glove, while from the unripe fruit, the stone can only be torn with difficulty, half the pulp clinging to its surface. Now, in the case of the sudden accidental death or of the suicide, the stone has to be torn from the unripe fruit. There is no question here about the moral blame which may attach to the act of suicide. Probably, in the majority of cases, such moral blame does attach to it, but that is a question of karma which will follow the person concerned into the next rebirth, like any other karma, and has nothing to do with the immediate difficulty such person may find in getting himself thoroughly and wholesomely dead. This difficulty is manifestly just the same, whether a person kills himself or is killed in the heroic discharge of duty, or dies the victim of an accident over which he has no control whatsoever. As an ordinary rule, when a person dies, the long account of karma naturally closes itself. That is to say, the complicated set of affinities which have been set up during life in the first durable principle, the fifth, is no longer susceptible of extension. The balance sheet, so to speak, is made out afterwards, when the time comes for the next objective birth, or in other words, the affinities long dormant in Devachan, by reason of the absence there of any scope for their action, assert themselves as soon as they come in contact once more with physical existence. But the fifth principle, in which these affinities are grown, cannot be separated, in the case of the person dying prematurely, from the earthly principle, the fourth. The elementary, therefore, which finds itself in Kama Loca, on its violent expulsion from the body, is not a mere shell, it is the person himself, who was lately alive, minus nothing but the body. In the true sense of the word, he is not dead at all. Certainly elementaries of this kind may communicate very effectually at spiritual seances at their own heavy cost, for they are unfortunately able, by reason of the completeness of their astral constitution, to go on generating karma, to assuage their thirst for life at the unwholesome spring of mediumship, If they were of a very material, sensual type in life, the enjoyments they will seek will be of a kind, the indulgence, of which in their disembodied state may readily be conceived even more prejudicial to their karma than similar indulgences would have been in life. In such cases facilis est descensus. Cut off in the full flush of earthly passions which bind them to familiar scenes, they are enticed by the opportunity which mediums afford for the gratification of these vicariously. They become the incubi and succubi of medieval writing, demons of thirst and gluttony, provoking their victims to crime. A brief essay on this subject, which I wrote last year, and from which I have reproduced some of the sentences just given, appeared in The Theosophist with a note, the authenticity of which I have reason to trust, and the tenor of which was as follows: the variety of states after death is greater, if possible, than the variety of human lives upon this earth. The victims of accident do not generally become earthwalkers, only those falling into the current of attraction who die full of some engrossing earthly passion, the selfish, who have never given a thought to the welfare of others, overtaken by death in the consummation, whether real or imaginary, of some master passion of their lives, the desire remaining unsatisfied, even after a full realization, and they still craving for more. Such personalities can never pass beyond the earth attraction to wait for the hour of deliverance in happy ignorance and full oblivion. Among the suicides, those to whom the above statement about provoking their victims to crime, etc. applies, are that class who commit the act, in consequence of a crime, to escape the penalty of human law or their own remorse. Natural law cannot be broken with impunity. The inexorable causal relation between action and result has its full sway only in the world of effects, the karma, Loca, and every case is met there by an adequate punishment, and in 1,000 ways that would require volumes even to describe them superficially. Those who wait for the hour of deliverance in happy ignorance and full oblivion are of course such victims of accident as have already on earth engendered pure and elevated affinities, and after death are as much beyond the reach of temptation in the shape of mediumistic currents as they would have been inaccessible in life to common incitements to crime. Entities of another kind occasionally to be found in Kama Loka have yet to be considered. We have followed the higher principles of persons recently dead, observing the separation of the astral dross from the spirituality durable portion, that spirituality durable portion being either holy or satanic in its nature, and provided for in Devachan or Avicii accordingly. We have examined the nature of the elementary shell cast off and preserving for a time a deceptive resemblance to a true entity. We have paid attention also to the exceptional cases of real four-principled beings in Kama Loka who are the victims of accident or suicide. But what happens to a personality which has absolutely no atom of spirituality, no trace of spiritual affinity in its fifth principle, either of the good or bad sort? Clearly, in such a case, there is nothing for the sixth principle to attract to itself, or, in other words, such a personality has already lost its sixth principle by the time death comes. But Kama Loka is no more a sphere of existence for such a personality than the subjective world. Kama Loka may be permanently inhabited by astral beings, by elementals, but can only be an antechamber to some other state for human beings. In the case imagined, the surviving personality is promptly drawn into the current of its future destinies, and these have nothing to do with this earth's atmosphere or with Devachan, but with that eighth sphere of which occasional mention will be found in older occult writings. It will have been unintelligible to ordinary readers hitherto why it was called the eighth sphere, but since the explanation, now given out for the first time, of the sevenfold constitution of our planetary system, the meaning will be clear enough. The spheres of the cyclic process of evolution are 7 in number, but there is an 8th in connection with our Earth being, it will be remembered, the turning point in the cyclic chain, and this 8th sphere is out of circuit, a cul-de-sac, and the bourne from which it may be truly said, no traveller returns. It will readily be guessed that the only sphere connected with our planetary chain, which is lower than our own in the scale, having spirit at the top and matter at the bottom, must itself be no less visible to the eye and to optical instruments than the Earth itself, and as the duties which this sphere has to perform in our planetary system are immediately associated with this Earth, there is not much mystery left now in the riddle of the 8th sphere, nor as to the place in the sky where it may be sought. The conditions of existence there, however, are topics on which the adepts are very reserved in their communications to uninitiated pupils, and concerning these I have for the present no further information to give. One statement, though, is definitely made, viz., that such a total degradation of a personality as may suffice to draw it, after death, into the attraction of the 8th sphere is of very rare occurrence. From the vast majority of lives, There is something which the higher principles may draw to themselves, something to redeem the page of existence just passed from total destruction. And here it must be remembered that the recollections of life in Devachan, very vivid as they are, as far as they go, touch only those episodes in life that are productive of the elevated sort of happiness, of which alone Devachan is qualified to take cognizance, whereas the life from which, for the time being, the cream is thus skimmed, may come to be remembered eventually in all its details quite fully. That complete remembrance is only achieved by the individual at the threshold of a far more exalted spiritual state than that which we are now concerned with, one which is attained far later on in the progress of vast cycles of evolution. Each one of the long series of lives that will have been passed through will then be, as it were, a page in a book to which the possessor can turn back at pleasure, even though many such pages will then seem to him most likely very dull reading, and will not be frequently referred to. It is this revival eventually of recollection concerning all the long-forgotten personalities that is really meant by the doctrine of the resurrection. But we have no time at present to stop and unravel the enigmas of symbolism as bearing upon the teachings at present under conveyance to the reader. It may be worthwhile to do this as a separate undertaking at a later period, but meanwhile, to revert to the narrative of how the facts stand, it may be explained that in the whole book of pages, when at last the resurrection has been accomplished, there will be no entirely infamous pages, for even if any given spiritual individuality has occasionally, during its passage through this world, been linked with personalities so deplorably and desperately degraded that they have passed completely into the attraction of the lower vortex, that spiritual individuality in such cases will have retained, in its own affinities, no trace or taint of them. Those pages will, as it were, have been cleanly torn out from the book, and, as at the end of the struggle, after crossing Loca, the spiritual individuality will have passed into the unconscious gestation state from which, skipping the Devachan state, it will be, directly, though not immediately in time, reborn into its next life of objective activity. All the self-consciousness connected with that existence will have passed into the lower world, there eventually, to perish everlastingly, an expression of which, as of so many more, modern theology has proved a faithless custodian, making pure nonsense out of psycho-scientific facts. Annotations. There is no part of the present volume which I now regard as in so much urgent need of amplification as the 2 chapters which have just been passed. The Loca stage of existence, and that higher region or state of Devachan, to which it is but the antechamber, were, designedly left by our teachers in the first instance in partial obscurity, in order that the whole scheme of evolution might be the better understood. The spiritual state which immediately follows our present physical life is a department of nature, the study of which is almost unhealthily attractive for everyone who once realizes that some contact with it, some processes of experiment with its conditions, are possible even during this life. Already we can, to a certain extent, discern the phenomena of that state of existence into which a human creature passes at the death of the body. The experience of spiritualism has supplied us with facts concerning it in very great abundance. These facts are but too highly suggestive of theories and inferences which seem to reach the ultimate limits of speculation, and nothing but the bracing mental discipline of esoteric study in its broadest aspect will protect any mind addressed to the consideration of these facts from conclusions which that study shows to be necessarily erroneous. For this reason, theosophical inquirers have nothing to regret as far as their own progress in spiritual science is at stake, in the circumstances which have hitherto induced them to be rather neglectful of the problems that have to do with the state of existence next following our own. It is impossible to exaggerate the intellectual advantages to be derived from studying the broad design of nature throughout those vast realms of the future, which only the perfect clairvoyance of the adepts can penetrate before going into details regarding that spiritual foreground, which is partially accessible to less powerful vision, but liable, on a first acquaintance, to be mistaken for the whole expanse of the future. The earlier processes, however, through which the soul passes at death, may be described at this date somewhat more fully than they are defined in the foregoing chapter. The nature of the struggle that takes place in Loca between the upper and lower duads may now, I believe, be apprehended more clearly than at first. That struggle appears to be a very protracted and variegated process, and to constitute, not as some of us may have conjectured at first, an automatic or unconscious assertion of affinities or forces quite ready to determine the future of the spiritual monad at the period of death, but a phase of existence which may be, and in the vast majority of cases is more than likely to be, continued over a considerable series of years. And during this phase of existence, It is quite possible for departed human entities to manifest themselves to still living persons through the agency of spiritual mediumship, in a way which may go far towards accounting for, if it does not altogether vindicate, the impressions that spiritualists derive from such communications. But we must not conclude too hastily that the human soul going through the struggle or evolution of Karma Loka is in all respects what the first glance at the position, as thus defined, may seem to suggest. First of all, we must beware of too grossly materializing our conception of the struggle by thinking of it as a mechanical separation of principles. There is a mechanical separation involved in the discard of lower principles when the consciousness of the ego is firmly seated in the higher. Thus at death the body is mechanically discarded by the soul, which in union perhaps with intermediate principles may actually be seen by some clairvoyance of a high order to quit the tenement it needs no longer. And a very similar process may ultimately take place in Karma Loka itself, in regard to the matter of the astral principles. But postponing this consideration for a few moments, it is important to avoid supposing that the struggle of Karma Loka does itself constitute this ultimate division of principles, or second death upon the astral plane. The struggle of Karma Loka is in fact the life of the entity in that phase of existence, as quite correctly stated in the text of the foregoing chapter. The evolution taking place during that phase of existence is not concerned with the responsible choice between good and evil which goes on during physical life. Karma Loka is a portion of the great world of effects, not a sphere in which causes are generated except under peculiar circumstances. The Karma Loka entity, therefore, is not truly master of his own acts. He is rather the sport of his own already established affinities. But these are all the while asserting themselves or exhausting themselves by degrees, and the Karma Loka entity has an existence of vivid consciousness of one sort or another the whole time. Now a moment's reflection will show that those affinities which are gathering strength and asserting themselves have to do with the spiritual aspirations of the life last experienced, while those which are exhausting themselves have to do with its material tastes, emotions, and proclivities. The Karma Loka entity, be it remembered, is on his way to Devachan, or, in other words, is growing into that state, which is the Devachanic state, and the process of growth is accomplished by action and reaction, by ebb and flow like almost every other in nature, by a species of oscillation between the conflicting attractions of matter and spirit. Thus the ego advances towards heaven, so to speak, or recedes towards earth, during his Karma Loka existence, and it is just this tendency to oscillate between the two poles of thought or condition that brings him back occasionally within the sphere of the life he has just quitted. It is not by any means at once that his ardent sympathies with that life are dissipated. His sympathies with the higher aspects of that life, be it remembered, are not even on their way to dissipation. For instance, in what is here referred to as earthly affinity, we need not include the exercise of affection, which is a function of devachanic existence in a preeminent degree. But perhaps even in regard to his affections, there may be earthly and spiritual aspects of these, and the contemplation of them with the circumstances and surroundings of the earth life may often have to do with the recession towards earth life of the Karma Loka entity referred to above. Of course, it will be apparent at once that the intercourse which the practice of spiritualism sets up between the Karma Loka entities as here in view and the friends they have left on earth must go on during those periods of the soul's existence in which earth memories engage its attention. And there are two considerations of a very important nature which arise out of this reflection. First, while its attention is thus directed, it is turned away from the spiritual progress on which it is engaged during its oscillations in the other direction. It may fairly well remember, and in conversation refer to, the spiritual aspirations of the life on earth, but its new spiritual experiences appear to be of an order that cannot be translated back into terms of the ordinary physical intellect, and, besides that, to be not within the command of the faculties which are in operation in the soul during its occupation with old earth memories. The position might be roughly symbolized, but only to a very imperfect extent, by the case of a poor emigrant whom we may imagine prospering in his new country, getting educated there, concerning himself with its public affairs and discoveries, philanthropy, and so on. He may keep up an interchange of letters with his relations at home, but he will find it difficult to keep them au courant with all that has come to be occupying his thoughts. The illustration will only fully apply to our present purpose, however, if we think of the emigrant as subject to a psychological law which draws a veil over his understanding when he sits down to write to his former friends, and restores him during that time to his former mental condition. He would then be less and less able to write about the old topics as time went on, for they would not only be below the level of those to the consideration of which his real mental activities had risen, but would to a great extent have faded from his memory. His letters would be a source of surprise to their recipients, who would say to themselves that it was certainly so-and-so who was writing, but that he had grown very dull and stupid compared to what he used to be before he went abroad. 2. NDI. It must be borne in mind that a very well-known law of physiology, according to which faculties are invigorated by use and atrophied by neglect, applies on the astral as well as on the physical plane. The soul in Kama Loka, which acquires the habit of fixing its attention on the memories of the life it has quitted, will strengthen and harden those tendencies which are at war with its higher impulses. The more frequently it is appealed to by the affection of friends still in the body to avail itself of the opportunities furnished by mediumship for manifesting its existence on the physical plane, the more vehement will be the impulses which draw it back to physical life, and the more serious the retardation of its spiritual progress. This consideration appears to involve the most influential motive which leads the representatives of theosophical teaching to discountenance and disapprove of all attempts to hold communication with departed souls by means of a spiritual séance. The more such communications are genuine, the more detrimental they are to the inhabitants of Kama Loka concerned with them. In the present state of our knowledge, it is difficult to determine with confidence the extent to which the Kama Loka entities are thus injured, and we may be tempted to believe that in some cases the great satisfaction derived by the living persons who communicate may outweigh the injury so inflicted on the departed soul. This satisfaction, however, will only be keen in proportion to the failure of the still living friend to realize the circumstances under which the communication takes place. At first, it is true, very shortly after death, the still vivid and complete memories of earth life may enable the Kama Loka entity to manifest himself as a personage very fairly like his deceased self. But from the moment of death, the change in the direction of his evolution sets in. He will, as manifesting on the physical plane, betray no fresh fermentation of thought in his mind. He will never, in that manifestation, be any wiser or higher in the scale of nature than he was when he died. On the contrary, he must become less and less intelligent, and apparently less instructed than formerly as time goes on. He will never do himself justice in communication with the friends left behind, and his failure in this respect will grow more and more painful by degrees. Yet another consideration operates to throw a very doubtful light on the wisdom or propriety of gratifying a desire for intercourse with deceased friends. We may say, never mind the gradually fading interest of the friend who has gone before. In the earth left behind, while there is anything of his or her old self left to manifest itself to us, it will be a delight to communicate even with that. And we may argue that if the beloved person is delayed a little on his way to heaven by talking with us, he or she would be willing to make that sacrifice for our sake. The point overlooked here is that on the astral, just as on the physical plane, it is a very easy thing to set up a bad habit. The soul in Kama Loka, once slaking a thirst for earthly intercourse at the wells of mediumship, will have a strong impulse to fall back again and again on that indulgence. We may be doing a great deal more than diverting the soul's attention from its own proper business by holding spiritualistic relations with it. We may be doing it serious and almost permanent injury. I am not affirming that this would invariably or generally be the case, but a severe view of the ethics of the subject must recognize the dangerous possibilities involved in the course of action under review. On the other hand, however, it is plain that cases may arise in which the desire for communication chiefly asserts itself from the other side, that is to say, in which the departed soul is laden with some unsatisfied desire, pointing possibly towards the fulfillment of some neglected duty on earth. The attention to which on the part of still living friends may have an effect quite the reverse of that attending the mere encouragement of the Kama Loka entity in the resumption of its old earthly interests. In such cases, the living friends may, by falling in with its desire to communicate, be the means, indirectly, of smoothing the path of its spiritual progress. Here again, however, we must be on our guard against the delusive aspect of appearances. A wish manifested by an inhabitant of Kama Loka may not always be the expression of an idea then operative in his mind. It may be the echo of an old, perhaps of a very old desire, then for the first time finding a channel for its outward expression. In this way, although it would be reasonable to treat as important an intelligible wish conveyed to us from Kama Loka by a person only lately deceased, it would be prudent to regard with great suspicion such a wish emanating from the shade of a person who had been dead a long time, and whose general demeanor as a shade did not seem to convey the notion that he retained any vivid consciousness of his old personality. The recognition of all these facts and possibilities of Kama Loka will, I think, afford theosophists a satisfactory explanation of a good. Many experiences connected with spiritualism, which the first exposition of the esoteric doctrine, as bearing on this matter, left in much obscurity. It will be readily perceived that as the soul slowly clears itself in Kama Loka of the affinities which retard its devachanic development, the aspect it turns towards the earth is more and more enfeebled, and it is inevitable that there must always be in Kama Loka an enormous number of entities nearly ripe for a complete mergence in Devachan, who on that very account appear to an earthly observer in a state of advanced decrepitude. These will have sunk, as regards the activity of their lower astral principles, into the condition of the altogether vague and unintelligible entities which, following the example of older occult writers, I have referred to as shells in the text of this chapter. The designation, however, is not altogether a happy one. It might have been better to have followed another precedent, and to have called them shades, but either way their condition would be the same. All the vivid consciousness inhering, as they left the earth, in the principles appropriately related to the activities of physical life, has been transferred to the higher principles which do not manifest at seances. Their memory of earth life has almost become extinct. Their lower principles are in such cases only reawakened by the influences of the mediumistic current into which they may be drawn, and they become then little more than astral-looking glasses, in which the thoughts of the medium or sitters at the seance are reflected. If we can imagine the colors on a painted canvas sinking by degrees into the substance of the material, and at last re-emerging in their pristine brilliancy on the other side, we shall be conceiving a process which might not have destroyed the picture, but which would leave a gallery in which it took place, a dreary scene of brown and meaningless backs. And that is very much what the Kama Loka entities become before. They ultimately shed the very material on which their first astral consciousness operated, and pass into the wholly purified devachanic condition. But this is not the whole of the story which teaches us to regard manifestations coming from Kama Loka with distrust. Our present comprehension of the subject enables us to realize that when the time arrives for that second death on the astral plane, which releases the purified ego from Kama Loka altogether and sends it onward to the devachanic state, something is left behind in Kama Loka which corresponds to the dead body bequeathed to the earth when the soul takes its first flight from physical existence. A dead astral body is in fact left behind in Kama Loka, and there is certainly no impropriety in applying the epithet shell to that residuum. The true shell in that state disintegrates in Kama Loka before very long, just as the true body left to the legitimate processes of nature on earth would soon decay and blend its elements with the general reservoirs of matter of the order to which they belong. But until that disintegration is accomplished, the shell which the real ego has altogether abandoned may even in that state be mistaken sometimes at spiritual seances for a living entity. It remains for a time an astral-looking glass, in which mediums may see their own thoughts reflected, and take these back, fully, believing them to come from an external source. These phenomena, in the truest sense of the term, are galvanized astral corpses, none the less so, because until they are actually disintegrated, a certain subtle connection will subsist between them and the true devachanic spirit, just as such a subtle communication subsists in the first instance between the Kama Loka entity and the dead body left on earth. That last mentioned communication is kept up by the finely diffused material of the original third principle, or Linga Sharira, and a study of this branch of the subject will, I believe, lead us up to a better comprehension than we possess at present of the circumstances under which materializations are sometimes accomplished at spiritual seances. But without going into that digression now, it is enough to recognize that the analogy may help to show how, between the devachanic entity and the discarded shell in Kama Loka A, similar connection may continue for a while, acting, while it lasts, as a drag on the higher spirit, but perhaps as an afterglow of sunset on the shell. It would surely be distressing, however, in the highest degree, to any living friend of the person concerned, to get, through clairvoyance or in any other way, sight or cognition of such a shell, and to be led into mistaking it for the true entity. The comparatively clear view of Kama Loka which we are now enabled to take may help us to employ terms relating to its phenomena with more precision than we have hitherto been able to attain. I think if we adopt one new expression, astral soul, as applying to the entities in Kama Loka who have recently quitted earth life, or who for other reasons still retain, in the aspect they turn back towards earth, a large share of the intellectual attributes that distinguish them on earth, we shall then find the other terms in use already, adequate to meet our remaining emergencies. Indeed, we may then get rid entirely of the inconvenient term elementary, liable to be confused with elemental, and singularly inappropriate to the beings it describes. I would suggest that the astral soul as it sinks, regarded from our point of view, into intellectual decrepitude, should be spoken of in its faded condition as a shade, and that the term shell should be reserved for the true shells or astral dead bodies which the Devachanic spirit has finally quitted. We are naturally led in studying the law of spiritual growth in Kama Loka to inquire how long a time may probably elapse before the transfer of consciousness from the lower to the higher. Principles of the astral soul may be regarded as complete, and as usual, when we come to figures relating to the higher processes of nature, the answer is very elastic. But I believe the esoteric teachers of the East declare that as regards the average run of humanity, for what may be called, in a spiritual sense, the great middle classes of humanity, it is unusual that a Kama Loka entity will be in a position to manifest as such for more than 25 to 30 years. But on each side of this average, the figures may run up very considerably. That is to say, a very ignoble and besotted human creature may hang about in Kama Loka for a much longer time, for want of any higher principles sufficiently developed to take up his consciousness at all, and at the other end of the scale, the very intellectual and mentally active soul may remain for very long periods in Kama Loka, in the absence of spiritual affinities in corresponding force, by reason of the great persistence of forces and causes generated on the higher plane of effects, though mental. Activity could hardly be divorced in this way from spirituality, except in cases where it was exclusively associated with worldly ambition. Again, while Kama Loka periods may thus be prolonged beyond the average from various causes, they may sink to almost infinitesimal brevity when the spirituality of a person dying at a ripe old age, and at the close of a life which has legitimately fulfilled its purpose, is already far advanced. There is one other important possibility connected with manifestations reaching us by the usual channels of communication with Kama Loka, which it is desirable to notice here, although from its nature the realization of such a possibility cannot be frequent. No recent students of theosophy can expect to know as yet very much about the conditions of existence which await adepts who relinquish the use of physical bodies on earth. The higher possibilities open to them appear to me quite beyond the reach of intellectual appreciation. No man is clever enough, by virtue of the mere cleverness seated in a living brain, to understand nirvana. But it would appear that adepts in some cases elect to pursue a course lying midway between reincarnation and the passage into nirvana, and in the higher regions of Devachan, that is to say, in the arupa state of Devachan, may await the slow advance of human evolution towards the exalted condition they have thus attained. Now, an adept who has thus become a Devachanic spirit of the most elevated type would not be cut off by the conditions of his Devachanic state, as would be the case with a natural Devachanic spirit passing through that state on his way to reincarnation, from manifesting his influence on earth. His would certainly not be an influence which would make itself felt by the instrumentality of any physical signs to mixed audiences, but it is not impossible that a medium of the highest type, who would more properly be called a seer, might be thus influenced. By such an adept spirit, some great men in the world's history may from time to time have been overshadowed and inspired, consciously or unconsciously, as the case may have been. The disintegration of shells in Kama Loka will inevitably suggest to anyone who endeavors to comprehend the process at all that there must be in nature some general reservoirs of the matter appropriate to that sphere of existence, corresponding to the physical earth and its surrounding elements into which our own bodies are resigned at death. The grand mysteries on which this consideration impinges will claim a far more exhaustive investigation than we have yet been enabled to undertake, but one broad idea connected with them may usefully be put forward without further delay. The state of Kama Loka is one which has its corresponding orders of matter in manifestation round it. I will not here attempt to go into the metaphysics of the problem, which might even lead us to discard the notion that astral matter need be any less real and tangible than that which appeals to our physical senses. It is enough for the present to explain that the propinquity of Kama Loka to the earth, which is so readily made apparent by spiritualistic experience, is explained by Oriental teaching to arise from this fact, that Kama Loka is just as much in and of the earth as, during our lives, our astral soul is in and of the living man. The stage of Kama Loka, in fact, the great realm of matter in the appropriate state, which constitutes Kama Loka and is perceptible to the senses of astral entities, as also to those of many clairvoyants, is the fourth principle of man. For the earth has its 7 principles, like the human creatures who inhabit it. Thus, the Devachanic state corresponds to the 5th principle of the earth, and nirvana to the 6th principle.